They thought I was just a clueless old man, a worn-out construction contractor who didn't understand their elite high-tech world. My own son-in-law kicked me out of my 70th birthday dinner, a dinner I was paying for, just to appease his arrogant mother. But they forgot one crucial detail. I spent 40 years pouring concrete and laying steel. I know exactly how to build a rock-solid foundation. And more importantly, I know exactly where to hit to bring the whole building crashing down into the dust. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. It was raining that Friday night in Seattle. That cold, relentless drizzle that chills you right down to the bone. I was turning 70. 70 years on this earth, 40 of them spent waking up at 4 in the morning, gripping freezing steel rebar, breathing in concrete dust, building a life so my daughter would never have to know what it felt like to be hungry or scared. We were at the Metropolitan, one of those upscale steakhouses downtown, where the menus do not have prices and the waiters wear better suits than I do. I was the one paying. I had handed my platinum credit card to the maitre d' the moment I walked in, wanting the night to be seamless, wanting a quiet, peaceful celebration with my only daughter, Melanie. But peace was not on the menu. Sitting across from me was Derek Stanton, the man my daughter married. He was wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first truck. He was the CEO of some tech startup that was supposedly always on the verge of making millions, though I had yet to see any actual proof of it. And sitting next to him was his mother, Beverly Stanton. Beverly was a woman who wore far too much perfume and heavy jewelry that clinked loudly every time she moved her wrists. From the moment we sat down, she made it her personal mission to let everyone in the room know that this restaurant, this table, and specifically my presence, were entirely beneath her. "This table is completely unacceptable," Beverly announced loudly, waving her hand dismissively at the passing waiter. "We are practically sitting in the kitchen." "Derek, did you not tell them who we are?" Derek sighed, adjusting his expensive watch. "I am sorry, Mother. Richard made the reservations. He did not call me Dad. He rarely did anymore. Just Richard." Spoken with a subtle sneer, like my name left a bad taste in his mouth. I kept my mouth shut. I took a sip of my water. I was determined not to let them ruin my 70th birthday. I looked at Melanie, my little girl. She was sitting there, staring intently at her napkin, her shoulders hunched. She looked exhausted. Her expensive dress seemed to swallow her up. I wanted to ask her how she was really doing, but Beverly's voice cut through the air again, sharp as shattered glass. "Well, it shows," Beverly scoffed, inspecting her silverware as if she expected to find dirt on it. "I suppose we cannot expect someone with such blue-collar tastes to understand the nuances of fine dining. Honestly, Richard, I am surprised you did not just drag us all to a local diner for a greasy hamburger. It would be much more your speed, would it not?" "Mother, please," Derek murmured, though a smirk played on his lips. He was not stopping her. He was encouraging her. I kept my hands folded on the table. My knuckles were thick and scarred from decades of intense physical labor. I looked at them, then looked at Beverly. "The steak here is supposed to be excellent, Beverly. Let us just enjoy the meal." But Beverly was not interested in enjoying the meal. She was interested in establishing dominance. When the waiter approached to pour the wine, a bottle of imported Cabernet that cost more than my weekly groceries back in the day, Beverly yanked her glass away just as he was pouring. The dark red liquid splashed violently across the crisp white tablecloth, narrowly missing my sleeve. The waiter immediately began apologizing, rushing to clean the mess with a cloth. "Oh, for heaven's sake, you clumsy fool!" Beverly shrieked. Heads turned at neighboring tables. The low hum of sophisticated conversation in the restaurant ground to an absolute halt. "Look what you have done. This is exactly what I mean. The service here is atrocious." The waiter, a young man who looked like he was just trying to pay his way through college, kept apologizing, his face burning red with embarrassment. "That is enough, Beverly," I said, my voice low but firm. "It was an accident, and frankly, you moved your glass." Beverly's eyes snapped to me. They were cold, hard, and utterly devoid of empathy. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the stained tablecloth. "Excuse me, are you correcting me?" I am asking you to treat the staff with basic respect," I replied calmly, "and to keep your voice down." Derek slammed his hand on the table. "Do not speak to my mother like that, Richard. She has every right to expect decent service." "It is fine," Derek Beverly said, waving a hand dramatically. She let out a cruel, condescending laugh. "We really should not be surprised. After all, look who we are dealing with. A man who spent his life rolling around in the dirt. It makes perfect sense that he would lack basic social etiquette." She took a sip of her water, eyeing me with pure malice, and then she crossed the line. The one absolute line I had drawn in the sand. "It really is a tragedy about your late wife," Beverly said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Patty, was it not? I remember seeing pictures. Such a simple, plain woman. It must have been so difficult for her trying to pretend she belonged in a civilized society. But I suppose low-class trash always finds a way to justify its own lack of refinement." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The clinking of glasses, the soft jazz playing in the background, all of it faded away. There was only the sound of blood rushing in my ears. Patty. My Patty. The woman who stood by me when we had nothing but $20 to our name and a leaking roof over our heads. She used to pack my lunches at 4 in the morning, her hands dusted with flour from the night shift at the local bakery. She taught Melanie how to read, how to be strong, how to be kind. To hear her name spoken like dirt in the mouth of a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life was a violation I could not ignore. I looked at Melanie. I expected my daughter to say something, to stand up, to defend the memory of the mother who had loved her fiercely. But Melanie just shrank further into her chair. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she remained completely, utterly silent, terrified of her own husband, terrified of her mother-in-law. I shifted my gaze to Derek. I waited for him to act like a man, to apologize for his mother's abhorrent behavior, to show even a sliver of basic human decency. Instead, Derek looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He leaned back in his chair, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and delivered the words that would ultimately seal his fate. "Dad, just leave," Derek said. His tone was not angry, it was dismissive, like he was shooing away a stray dog. "You are ruining my mother's evening with your negative energy. Go home." My own son-in-law, sitting at a table I paid for, celebrating my 70th birthday, telling me to leave so his mother could enjoy her evening. A lesser man would have screamed. A lesser man would have flipped the table, caused a massive scene, yelled until his throat was raw. But I did not scream. I did not say a single word. Anger is a hot flame, but true rage, the kind of rage that changes the course of lives, is ice cold. I slowly pushed my chair back. The heavy wood scraped against the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet tension of the room. I stood up to my full height. Even at 70, I am a broad-shouldered man, built solid from a lifetime of heavy lifting. I buttoned my suit jacket deliberately, methodically. I looked down at Derek. I stared dead into his eyes. I did not blink. I let the silence stretch out heavy and suffocating. I saw a brief flicker of unease cross his face, a sudden fleeting realization that he might have pushed a bit too far, but his sheer arrogance quickly swallowed it up. I did not say goodbye to him. I did not say goodbye to Beverly. I looked at Melanie one last time, feeling a profound wave of pity for the coward she had become, and then I turned around. I walked with slow, measured steps toward the exit of the restaurant. I kept my back straight and my head held high. But before I reached the heavy glass doors leading out into the Seattle rain, I paused. I stopped at the maitre d' station. The manager was standing there, looking incredibly uncomfortable about the scene that had just unfolded. I leaned in close. My voice was calm, almost a whisper, but perfectly clear. The platinum card I gave you earlier, I said softly. Yes, Mr. Caldwell, the manager asked nervously. Cancel it. Void the transaction entirely. Then print the final itemized bill and hand it directly to the gentleman in the tailored suit at table 4. And under no circumstances are you to let them leave without paying. The manager's eyes widened, but he gave a slow, understanding nod. I turned my collar up against the cold, pushed open the doors, and stepped out into the night. I did not know it yet, but as the rain hit my face, the absolute demolition of Derek Stanton's perfect life had already begun. The cold Seattle rain hit my face the moment I stepped outside the restaurant doors. It was a sharp, biting drizzle, the kind that soaks through your clothes and chills you right down to the bone in a matter of seconds. I welcomed it. The icy sting was a stark contrast to the suffocating, perfumed heat of the dining room I had just left behind. I stood under the awning for a brief moment, letting the damp air clear the heavy fog of anger that was threatening to cloud my judgment. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of wet asphalt and pine into my lungs. 40 years of pouring foundation and laying steel had taught me one undeniable truth about survival. You never let them see you sweat, and you absolutely never let them see you bleed. I walked across the slick, glistening pavement toward the far corner of the parking lot. The valet had parked my vehicle as far away from the entrance as possible, likely to avoid offending the delicate sensibilities of the patrons arriving in their imported luxury sedans. I did not mind. My battered 15-year-old Ford truck sat waiting under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. It was a machine built for labor, not for show. The tailgate was marked with a dozen small dents. The paint was fading along the wheel arches, and concrete dust was permanently ground into the heavy rubber floor mats. It was a testament to decades of honest, backbreaking work. I unlocked the heavy metal door, climbed into the driver's seat, and firmly shut the door against the wind. I did not turn the key in the ignition. I did not turn on the headlights. I sat completely still in the dark, cold cab of my truck, my hands resting heavily on the worn leather of the steering wheel. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the restaurant's massive bay windows. It was like watching a silent movie play out on a brilliantly lit stage. The interior of the steakhouse glowed with a warm amber light, casting a golden hue over the pristine white tablecloths and the sparkling crystal glasses. From my vantage point in the shadows, I could see table 4 clearly. I could see my daughter Melanie sitting with her shoulders hunched, staring down at her lap. I could see Beverly waving her hands in animated complaint. And I could see Derek leaning back in his chair with that signature aura of arrogant invincibility. I watched as the young waiter approached their table. He was moving with a noticeable hesitation, carrying the black leather booklet that held the bill. $3,000. $3,000 for dry, aged steaks that barely filled a plate, imported caviar, and wine that tasted like bitter dirt to a man who preferred a simple domestic beer. The waiter stepped up to Derek's side and gently placed the leather booklet on the table. He stood back, keeping his hands clasped respectfully behind his back. From the dark cab of my truck, I watched Derek's reaction. He did not even bother to look up at the young man. He simply raised a manicured finger and pointed casually toward the spot on the table where my platinum credit card had been resting just moments before. He waved his hand in a dismissive, sweeping motion, instructing the waiter to just process the payment and leave them be. The waiter leaned down slightly. Even through the thick glass and the pouring rain, I could almost hear the apologetic stammer in the young man's voice. I watched the waiter slowly shake his head. He gestured with open palms, explaining that the card was no longer there, explaining that the older gentleman had permanently canceled the transaction on his way out the door. Derek's arrogant posture instantly stiffened. The smug, untouchable smile vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, visible scowl of profound annoyance. He threw his hands up in a theatrical display of exasperation, clearly cursing my name for being so petty. He muttered something to his mother, who rolled her eyes dramatically, and let out a harsh laugh, undoubtedly making another cruel remark about my lack of class. Derek shook his head, reached inside his tailored designer jacket, and pulled out his own sleek leather wallet. He withdrew a heavy solid metal credit card, the kind of card that is supposed to command instant respect and signal unlimited wealth. He tossed it onto the table with a flick of his wrist, not bothering to hand it directly to the waiter. The young man picked it up, silently nodded, and walked away toward the manager's station near the back of the dining room. I leaned back against the headrest of my truck, watching the rain slide down the glass. The damp cold was seeping through my suit jacket, but I barely registered it. I kept my eyes fixed on table 4. 5 minutes passed. The tension inside the restaurant seemed to shift, growing tighter with every passing second. The waiter returned. This time he was not alone. The restaurant manager, a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit, was walking closely beside him. The manager held Derek's metal credit card between his fingers. They approached the table, and the manager leaned down, shielding his voice from the neighboring patrons. He handed the heavy metal card back to Derek. He shook his head apologetically. Declined. Derek's mouth opened in sheer disbelief. He snatched the card from the manager's hand, his face flushing a sudden furious shade of crimson. He pointed at the card, tapping it against the table, clearly arguing that their machine must be broken. The manager maintained his polite professional posture, but shook his head again. The machine was working perfectly fine. The funds simply were not there. Derek shoved his hand back into his wallet with frantic energy. He pulled out a second card, a shiny gold piece of plastic, and practically shoved it into the manager's chest. The manager took it, gave a tight nod, and walked away again. I sat completely motionless in the dark. A strange, heavy realization was beginning to form in the back of my mind. Derek Stanton was the chief executive officer of an emerging technology startup. He drove a brand new imported sports car. He wore suits that cost thousands of dollars. Just 2 years ago, I had liquidated a massive portion of my lifelong retirement savings. I had pulled out $1.2 million in hard cold cash to purchase a sprawling, immaculate mansion in the elite suburbs of Bellevue for him and Melanie. I bought that house completely free and clear so my daughter would never have to worry about a mortgage payment for the rest of her life. If Derek was a wildly successful executive living in a $1 million mansion with zero debt, why was he struggling to cover a simple dinner bill? I watched the manager return to table 4. He handed the gold card back. He shook his head for the 3rd time, declined again. The illusion completely shattered right before my eyes. Derek was suddenly sweating. He was aggressively patting down his pockets, his movements jerky and panicked. He pulled out a 3rd card, then a 4th, his hands visibly shaking as he laid them out on the white tablecloth. The manager stood his ground, his polite demeanor hardening into strict institutional policy. He was not going to let them walk out of that building without settling a $3,000 tab. Beverly Stanton finally realized what was happening. Her face, previously stretched into a mask of smug superiority, twisted into an ugly portrait of absolute horror. She began pointing her finger at the manager, shouting loudly enough that several nearby tables stopped eating to stare at the unfolding spectacle. She was throwing a massive, uncontrollable fit, her heavy jewelry clattering loudly against the table. She demanded they call the bank. She demanded they respect who she was. But respect is not a currency that pays the bills. Melanie buried her face in her hands, utterly humiliated, paralyzed by the chaos erupting around her. Derek was standing up now, arguing aggressively with the manager, trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of his fabricated dignity remained. They were trapped. A grim, hollow satisfaction settled in my chest. The great Derek Stanton, the man who had just commanded me to leave my own birthday dinner because my blue-collar presence was an embarrassment, was currently standing in the middle of a luxury steakhouse with a wallet full of worthless plastic, exposed as a complete financial fraud. It was time to go. The show was over, and I had seen everything I needed to see. I reached forward and gripped the key in the ignition. I turned it, and the old Ford engine roared to life with a deep, familiar rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. I reached down to shift the truck into drive, ready to pull out of the parking lot and leave them to navigate the humiliating disaster they had created for themselves. Right as my hand gripped the gear shift, a sharp, sudden vibration startled me. My cell phone buzzed violently in the center console cup holder. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin of the truck, casting a harsh blue light over my scarred hands. I looked down. It was a text message. The sender name on the screen simply read, Derek. For a brief, naive second, a tiny part of me thought it might be a desperate plea for help. I thought he might be swallowing his massive pride, apologizing for the horrific way he and his mother had treated me, begging me to come back inside and pay the bill to save him from being arrested for theft of services. I picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. I opened the message. There was no apology. There was no plea for assistance. There was no explanation for the declined cards or the unpaid bill. There was only a single terrifying sentence that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. The text read, "You owe us $3,000 right now, or you will never see your grandson again." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone until the text message blurred into a harsh white light. The threat hung in the damp air of the truck cabin, heavy and suffocating. You owe us $3,000 right now, or you will never see your grandson again. A threat against a grandfather, using a little boy as a weapon over a restaurant bill. I locked the screen, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and pressed my foot on the gas pedal. The drive to my cabin took 45 minutes, but my mind was moving 1,000 miles an hour. The pouring rain turned the Seattle highways into a slick, dangerous mirror, reflecting the red taillights of the cars ahead of me. I navigated the familiar winding roads leading away from the glittering downtown skyline, moving toward the quiet, heavily wooded outskirts, where my modest wooden cabin sat, nestled among the tall, dark pine trees. I bought this small piece of land decades ago, back when my wife Patty and I were just starting out. It was simple, quiet, and completely paid for. I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sound of the rocks crunching beneath my heavy tires breaking the absolute silence of the woods. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark. My phone vibrated against the leather seat. Then it vibrated again, and again. A continuous, relentless buzzing that signaled a digital assault. I picked it up, stepped out into the freezing rain, and walked up the creaking wooden steps to my front porch. I unlocked the heavy oak door, stepped inside, and tossed my wet coat over a chair. The cabin was freezing, but I did not bother turning on the heater. I walked straight to the kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of tap water, and finally looked at the screen of my phone. The notification badge glowed with a terrifying intensity. 14 missed calls, 27 unread text messages, all of them from Derek, and 4 new voicemails. I took a slow sip of my water, leaning against the cold granite countertop, and pressed play on the first voicemail. Derek did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. His voice exploded through the small speaker of my phone, sharp, frantic, and dripping with an unhinged feral rage. He screamed that I was a petty, vindictive old man who had intentionally set out to destroy his mother and humiliate his family in front of the entire city. He claimed the restaurant had threatened to call the police, that the manager had treated them like common criminals, and that it was entirely my fault. He shouted that his credit cards were only declined because of a temporary bank security hold, a minor glitch that my abrupt dramatic exit had weaponized against him. I listened to his voice crack with fury as he yelled that my blue-collar mindset could not comprehend the stress of running a high-level technology startup. He ended the first message with another vile threat, promising that if I did not wire $3,000 to his account by midnight, he would file a restraining order to ensure I never stepped foot near his son again. I deleted the message. I played the second one. It was more of the same. Blame, deflection, and towering arrogance. He demanded I call the restaurant and take responsibility for the unpaid bill. He demanded I apologize to Beverly for disrespecting her. He sounded completely detached from reality, living in a fabricated universe where his financial failures were somehow the result of my actions. I deleted the second and third messages without finishing them. Then the fourth voicemail began to play. It was not Derek. It was my daughter. The sound of Melanie crying through the speaker hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Her voice was weak, trembling, and entirely stripped of the fierce, independent spirit Patty and I had worked so hard to instill in her. She was sobbing, her breath catching in her throat, as she spoke in a hushed, terrified whisper, clearly hiding somewhere in that massive house so her husband and mother-in-law would not hear her. "Dad, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, just wire the money to Derek. Just send it tonight. You know how he gets when he is embarrassed. Please, Dad. I am begging you. Just apologize to Beverly. Say it was a misunderstanding. Derek is just so stressed about his tech startup right now. He has investors breathing down his neck, and his money is tied up in company assets. You know how hard it is for him. You have to be the bigger person here, Dad. If you do not send the money, he is going to ban you from seeing Leo. I cannot stop him. Please just do this one thing for me so we can have peace. Do not make this worse." I stood in the dead silence of my kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. My own daughter. The brilliant, strong girl who used to help me carry lumber on the job site when she was a teenager. She was reduced to begging her father to submit to an abusive husband and a wicked mother-in-law, all to keep a fake, fragile peace. She was making excuses for a man who used his own child as a bargaining chip over a dinner bill. I slowly lowered the phone to the counter. The silence of the cabin pressed in on me, heavy and absolute. I did not feel sad anymore. The initial shock of the betrayal was rapidly burning away, leaving behind a cold, calculating clarity. My mind, trained for 40 years to measure angles, calculate load-bearing weights, and spot structural weaknesses, began to process the information. Melanie said Derek was stressed because his money was tied up in company assets. She said they just needed $3,000 to cover a dinner. I closed my eyes and ran the numbers. 2 years ago, Melanie came to me in tears, saying Derek needed a stable environment to launch his company, and they had found the perfect house in Bellevue. It was a sprawling, immaculate mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in the state. I wanted my daughter to be safe. I wanted my grandson to grow up in a home with a big backyard and good schools. So I went to the bank. I drained my hard-earned retirement cash. I pulled out $1.2 million, the sum total of decades of broken backs and blistered hands. I bought that house for them in cash. No mortgage. Free and clear. I paid the property taxes for the first 3 years in advance. They had no housing debt, no rent, no mortgage payments, nothing. If a man lives in $1 million mansion, completely rent-free, and he is supposedly the successful chief executive officer of a thriving technology startup, his bank account should be overflowing with disposable income. He should not have credit cards bouncing at a steakhouse. He should not be desperately extorting his elderly father-in-law for $3,000. The math simply did not add up. A man with no housing expenses and a massive tech salary does not panic over a restaurant tab unless he is completely, utterly broke. The realization hit me with the force of a swinging hammer. This was not about a ruined birthday dinner. This was not about Beverly throwing a tantrum. This was a massive structural collapse happening right in front of my eyes. A beautiful, freshly painted house looks perfect from the street, but if the termites have eaten through the support beams, it is only a matter of time before the roof caves in. Derek Stanton was not a successful entrepreneur. He was a fraud. And if he was bankrupt enough to bounce a credit card at a public restaurant, where did my $1.2 million actually go? It certainly was not sitting in some frozen offshore business account. The money had vanished. I stood perfectly still in my freezing kitchen, listening to the heavy rain battering against the tin roof of my cabin. The steady, rhythmic drumming sound cleared my head completely. I was not angry anymore. I was focused. The picture they had painted for me was a meticulously crafted lie, a beautiful facade designed to hide a desperate, crumbling reality. I looked out the kitchen window into the deep, dark, rainy woods surrounding my property. Something vile and toxic was actively rotting beneath the polished hardwood floorboards of their supposedly perfect, wealthy family. They thought I was just a naive old man who would blindly sign checks and walk away when insulted. They were wrong. I was going to rip up every single plank until I found out exactly what it was. The morning light crept through the tall pine trees outside my cabin window, casting long gray shadows across the wooden floorboards. The storm from the night before had finally passed, leaving the Seattle air thick with the smell of damp earth and crushed cedar needles. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the entire night sitting at my kitchen table with a notepad and a black pen, mapping out every timeline, every financial detail, and every excuse Derek had ever given me over the last 3 years. By the time I poured my first cup of bitter dark roast coffee, the fog in my mind was completely gone. I was waiting. I knew he would come. A man drowning in debt does not leave a lifeline unbothered for long. Right around 9 in the morning, the heavy silence of the woods was broken by the sharp, aggressive crunch of premium rubber tires on my gravel driveway. I walked over to the front window and pulled back the curtain. A brand new, flawless, black Porsche Cayenne rolled to a smooth stop just a few feet away from my battered Ford. It looked utterly ridiculous sitting there in the mud and wet leaves. The engine purred with a deep, expensive hum before shutting off. The driver's side door opened and Derek stepped out. He did not look like a man who had suffered a humiliating public breakdown the night before. He did not look like a man whose credit cards had bounced at a steakhouse. He stepped onto my muddy driveway wearing a pristine tailored navy blue designer suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie perfectly knotted at his collar. His hair was meticulously styled. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He adjusted his jacket, took a deep breath, and walked up the wooden steps to my porch with the unearned confidence of a seasoned con artist preparing to close a massive sale. I opened the heavy oak door before he could even raise his hand to knock. I stood in the doorway wearing my faded flannel shirt and work boots, holding my mug of coffee. I did not invite him inside. I just looked at him, letting the silence stretch out, forcing him to make the first move. Derek flashed a bright, perfectly practiced smile. It was the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes. There was no genuine warmth in his expression, no actual remorse for the horrific scene his mother had caused. He sighed heavily, dropping his shoulders in a calculated display of exhaustion, attempting to play the role of the weary, misunderstood family man. "Dad." He began, his voice dripping with a smooth, manufactured sincerity. "I am so glad you are home. I wanted to come out here first thing this morning to talk about last night. The entire situation was a complete disaster, and I feel terrible about how things escalated." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I did not offer him a cup. I did not nod. I simply waited for the pitch I knew was coming. Derek shifted his weight, putting his hands in his pockets to appear casual and non-threatening. "You have to understand," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a painful family secret. "My mother has not been herself lately. Beverly is suffering from severe age-related anxiety. Her doctors have been trying to adjust her medication for months. When she gets into crowded, noisy environments, she gets overwhelmed and she lashes out. She did not mean a single word she said about Patty. She was just having a medical episode. She is mortified this morning, completely devastated." I listened to his smooth, effortless lies, keeping my face entirely blank. Age-related anxiety. A medical episode. It was a fascinating, brilliant excuse. It completely absolved Beverly of any personal responsibility for being a vicious, cruel woman. It framed her as a tragic victim of a medical condition, making me look like an insensitive monster if I dared to hold a grudge against a sick, elderly widow. It was the perfect manipulation tactic. "I appreciate you explaining that to me," I said quietly. My voice gave away absolutely nothing. It is a terrible thing watching the mind fade. Derek immediately brightened, clearly believing he had successfully navigated the first hurdle. He took a step closer, adopting a conspiratorial man-to-man posture. He leaned against the wooden railing of my porch, looking out at the dripping pine trees. "I knew you would understand," Derek said smoothly. "You are a reasonable man, but I also need to apologize for the embarrassment with the check. I know how bad that looked. The truth is, my startup is going through a massive transitional phase right now." He paused, waiting for me to ask a question, but I remained silent. He cleared his throat and pressed on, accelerating his pitch. "We are currently in the final stages of closing a Series B venture capital injection. We are talking about $30 million from a major private equity firm based out of Singapore. Because the deal involves international wire transfers and massive asset restructuring, our corporate accounts have been temporarily frozen by the federal regulators just to ensure compliance. It is standard bureaucratic red tape. Unfortunately, my personal accounts are tied to the corporate ledger as the primary founder, so the bank put a 48-hour security hold on all my cards. I literally have millions of dollars sitting in offshore escrow accounts, and I cannot even buy a cup of coffee until the compliance officers clear the paperwork on Monday morning." It was a masterpiece of corporate jargon. Venture capital injection, asset restructuring, offshore escrow, compliance officers. To a simple construction worker, it was designed to sound overwhelmingly complex and incredibly impressive. It was a story built to explain away his total lack of liquid cash, while simultaneously reinforcing the illusion that he was a wildly successful multimillionaire executive. Derek let out another heavy theatrical sigh and rubbed his temples, performing the role of the exhausted provider, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and earnest, projecting absolute vulnerability. "The problem is," he continued, his voice dropping into a desperate pleading register, "I have 40 employees relying on me for their paychecks this week. These are good people, Dad. Engineers, developers, people with families. If the payroll bounces tomorrow, I lose my entire development team, and the $30 million deal falls apart completely. I am in a bind, and you are the only person I can trust." He took a breath, delivering the final calculated strike. "Dad, I just need a temporary $50,000 bridge loan to cover payroll this week. I will pay you back by next Wednesday, with 10% interest on top for the trouble. You know I am good for it. I just need this one small favor to keep the company afloat until the venture capital clears. $50,000. Just a small favor. A temporary bridge loan to save the phantom employees of a phantom company." He delivered the lie with such breathtaking confidence that I almost had to admire his absolute lack of a moral compass. He was trying to rob me blind while standing on my front porch, looking me right in the eye. I looked down at the wooden planks of my porch, letting out a slow, deliberate sigh to make him think I was genuinely considering his plea. I had to play the part perfectly. I had to let him believe the hook was firmly set in my mouth. $50,000 is a lot of money to move around on short notice, I said, keeping my tone hesitant and unsure. I will have to go to the bank and see what I can pull from my retirement accounts without taking a penalty. Let me look at my finances this weekend, and I will see what I can do for you." Derek beamed. The relief washing over his face was profound and genuine. He truly believed he had won. He stepped forward and grabbed my hand, shaking it vigorously. "Thank you, Dad. I knew I could count on you. You are a lifesaver. Melanie and Leo are so lucky to have you." I gave him a tight, polite nod. I walked down the porch steps with him stepping into the damp gravel driveway. I patted him on the back as we reached the gleaming black Porsche, playing the role of the supportive, gullible father-in-law to absolute perfection. Derek reached out and pulled the heavy handle of the driver's side door. The door swung open, and the interior light illuminated the pristine leather cabin of the luxury vehicle. I stood right behind him, maintaining my gentle smile. But as my eyes swept past his shoulder and glanced into the car, the smile vanished entirely. Resting openly on the passenger seat, carelessly tossed aside, was a thick stack of envelopes. They were not corporate documents. They were not venture capital contracts. They were heavy official government envelopes stamped with bold, glaring red ink across the front. I recognized those letters immediately. From my long decades in the construction business, you learn what absolute financial ruin looks like. They were final notices from the Internal Revenue Service, final demands for unpaid taxes, and explicit legally binding threats of immediate asset seizure. The cold Seattle rain hit my face the moment I stepped outside the restaurant doors. It was a sharp, biting drizzle, the kind that soaks through your clothes and chills you right down to the bone in a matter of seconds. I welcomed it. The icy sting was a stark contrast to the suffocating, perfumed heat of the dining room I had just left behind. I stood under the awning for a brief moment, letting the damp air clear the heavy fog of anger that was threatening to cloud my judgment. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of wet asphalt and pine into my lungs. 40 years of pouring foundation and laying steel had taught me one undeniable truth about survival. You never let them see you sweat, and you absolutely never let them see you bleed. I walked across the slick, glistening pavement toward the far corner of the parking lot. The valet had parked my vehicle as far away from the entrance as possible, likely to avoid offending the delicate sensibilities of the patrons arriving in their imported luxury sedans. I did not mind. My battered 15-year-old Ford truck sat waiting under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. It was a machine built for labor, not for show. The tailgate was marked with a dozen small dents. The paint was fading along the wheel arches, and concrete dust was permanently ground into the heavy rubber floor mats. It was a testament to decades of honest, backbreaking work. I unlocked the heavy metal door, climbed into the driver's seat, and firmly shut the door against the wind. I did not turn the key in the ignition. I did not turn on the headlights. I sat completely still in the dark, cold cab of my truck, my hands resting heavily on the worn leather of the steering wheel. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the restaurant's massive bay windows. It was like watching a silent movie play out on a brilliantly lit stage. The interior of the steakhouse glowed with a warm amber light, casting a golden hue over the pristine white tablecloths and the sparkling crystal glasses. From my vantage point in the shadows, I could see Table 4 clearly. I could see my daughter Melanie sitting with her shoulders hunched, staring down at her lap. I could see Beverly waving her hands in animated complaint. And I could see Derek leaning back in his chair with that signature aura of arrogant invincibility. I watched as the young waiter approached their table. He was moving with a noticeable hesitation, carrying the black leather booklet that held the bill. $3,000. $3,000 for dry-aged steaks that barely filled a plate, imported caviar, and wine that tasted like bitter dirt to a man who preferred a simple domestic beer. The waiter stepped up to Derek's side and gently placed the leather booklet on the table. He stood back, keeping his hands clasped respectfully behind his back. From the dark cab of my truck, I watched Derek's reaction. He did not even bother to look up at the young man. He simply raised a manicured finger and pointed casually toward the spot on the table where my platinum credit card had been resting just moments before. He waved his hand in a dismissive, sweeping motion, instructing the waiter to just process the payment and leave them be. The waiter leaned down slightly. Even through the thick glass and the pouring rain, I could almost hear the apologetic stammer in the young man's voice. I watched the waiter slowly shake his head. He gestured with open palms, explaining that the card was no longer there, explaining that the older gentleman had permanently canceled the transaction on his way out the door. Derek's arrogant posture instantly stiffened. The smug, untouchable smile vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, visible scowl of profound annoyance. He threw his hands up in a theatrical display of exasperation, clearly cursing my name for being so petty. He muttered something to his mother, who rolled her eyes dramatically and let out a harsh laugh, undoubtedly making another cruel remark about my lack of class. Derek shook his head, reached inside his tailored designer jacket, and pulled out his own sleek leather wallet. He withdrew a heavy, solid metal credit card, the kind of card that is supposed to command instant respect and signal unlimited wealth. He tossed it onto the table with a flick of his wrist, not bothering to hand it directly to the waiter. The young man picked it up, silently nodded, and walked away toward the manager's station near the back of the dining room. I leaned back against the headrest of my truck, watching the rain slide down the glass. The damp cold was seeping through my suit jacket, but I barely registered it. I kept my eyes fixed on table 4. 5 minutes passed. The tension inside the restaurant seemed to shift, growing tighter with every passing second. The waiter returned. This time he was not alone. The restaurant manager, a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit, was walking closely beside him. The manager held Derek's metal credit card between his fingers. They approached the table, and the manager leaned down, shielding his voice from the neighboring patrons. He handed the heavy metal card back to Derek. He shook his head apologetically. Declined. Derek's mouth opened in sheer disbelief. He snatched the card from the manager's hand, his face flushing a sudden, furious shade of crimson. He pointed at the card, tapping it against the table, clearly arguing that their machine must be broken. The manager maintained his polite professional posture, but shook his head again. The machine was working perfectly fine. The funds simply were not there. Derek shoved his hand back into his wallet with frantic energy. He pulled out a second card, a shiny gold piece of plastic, and practically shoved it into the manager's chest. The manager took it, gave a tight nod, and walked away again. I sat completely motionless in the dark. A strange, heavy realization was beginning to form in the back of my mind. Derek Stanton was the chief executive officer of an emerging technology startup. He drove a brand new imported sports car. He wore suits that cost thousands of dollars. Just 2 years ago, I had liquidated a massive portion of my lifelong retirement savings. I had pulled out $1.2 million in hard, cold cash to purchase a sprawling, immaculate mansion in the elite suburbs of Bellevue for him and Melanie. I bought that house completely free and clear so my daughter would never have to worry about a mortgage payment for the rest of her life. If Derek was a wildly successful executive living in a $1 million mansion with zero debt, why was he struggling to cover a simple dinner bill? I watched the manager return to table 4. He handed the gold card back. He shook his head for the 3rd time. Declined again. The illusion completely shattered right before my eyes. Derek was suddenly sweating. He was aggressively patting down his pockets, his movements jerky and panicked. He pulled out a 3rd card, then a 4th, his hands visibly shaking as he laid them out on the white tablecloth. The manager stood his ground, his polite demeanor hardening into strict institutional policy. He was not going to let them walk out of that building without settling a $3,000 tab. Beverly Stanton finally realized what was happening. Her face, previously stretched into a mask of smug superiority, twisted into an ugly portrait of absolute horror. She began pointing her finger at the manager, shouting loudly enough that several nearby tables stopped eating to stare at the unfolding spectacle. She was throwing a massive, uncontrollable fit, her heavy jewelry clattering loudly against the table. She demanded they call the bank. She demanded they respect who she was. But respect is not a currency that pays the bills. Melanie buried her face in her hands, utterly humiliated, paralyzed by the chaos erupting around her. Derek was standing up now, arguing aggressively with the manager, trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of his fabricated dignity remained. They were trapped. A grim, hollow satisfaction settled in my chest. The great Derek Stanton, the man who had just commanded me to leave my own birthday dinner because my blue-collar presence was an embarrassment, was currently standing in the middle of a luxury steakhouse with a wallet full of worthless plastic exposed as a complete financial fraud. It was time to go. The show was over, and I had seen everything I needed to see. I reached forward and gripped the key in the ignition. I turned it, and the old Ford engine roared to life with a deep, familiar rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. I reached down to shift the truck into drive, ready to pull out of the parking lot and leave them to navigate the humiliating disaster they had created for themselves. Right as my hand gripped the gear shift, a sharp, sudden vibration startled me. My cell phone buzzed violently in the center console cup holder. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin of the truck, casting a harsh blue light over my scarred hands. I looked down. It was a text message. The sender name on the screen simply read, Derek. For a brief, naive second, a tiny part of me thought it might be a desperate plea for help. I thought he might be swallowing his massive pride, apologizing for the horrific way he and his mother had treated me, begging me to come back inside and pay the bill to save him from being arrested for theft of services. I picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. I opened the message. There was no apology. There was no plea for assistance. There was no explanation for the declined cards or the unpaid bill. There was only a single terrifying sentence that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. The text read, "You owe us $3,000 right now, or you will never see your grandson again." I did not wait another second. The moment I processed the crushing reality of what was happening, I threw my battered Ford truck into gear and tore out of my gravel driveway. The heavy tires spun for a fraction of a second in the wet mud before firmly gripping the road. I was not going to sit in my quiet cabin and wait for the complete structural collapse of my daughter's life. I was going to drive straight into the absolute center of the disaster. The journey from my isolated woods to the pristine, manicured streets of Bellevue usually took 40 minutes, but my foot was heavy on the gas pedal. The passing scenery blurred into a continuous streak of gray and green. My mind was sharp, evaluating the angles, calculating the immense weight of the lies I had been fed. I needed a reason to be there. I needed an alibi that would not immediately trigger Derek's defensive maneuvers or cause them to lock the doors. Reaching over to the passenger seat, my calloused hand brushed against a small, hand-carved wooden fire truck. I had spent the last 3 weeks whittling it down, sanding the edges smooth for my grandson Leo. It was simple, solid, and honest. It was the perfect excuse for an unannounced visit from an overly eager grandfather. As I crossed into the exclusive neighborhood, the imposing multi-million-dollar estates loomed on either side of the wide, immaculate streets. I pulled up to the curb outside the massive stone and glass mansion I had purchased for them with $1.2 million of my own hard-earned cash. The driveway was empty. Derek's Porsche was nowhere to be seen, likely parked at whatever fake office he used to maintain his grand illusion. I grabbed the wooden toy truck, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and walked up the long, sweeping concrete walkway. I did not ring the doorbell. I did not knock. Months ago, Melanie had given me a spare key for emergencies. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key, slipped it into the ornate lock, and turned it with a satisfying metallic click. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open and stepped silently into the grand foyer. The air inside the house was thick and stifling, carrying a sharp, overwhelming chemical scent of heavy bleach and industrial floor cleaner. It did not smell like a home. It smelled like a sterile, soulless institution. The sprawling downstairs living area was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic wet sound of a bristled brush scrubbing violently against the imported marble tiles. I walked quietly past the sweeping entryway and turned the corner toward the massive open-concept kitchen. The sight that greeted me made the breath catch completely in my throat. My daughter. My brilliant, beautiful Melanie, who I had worked my entire life to protect from the harsh, grinding labor of the world, was on her hands and knees. She was wearing a faded, oversized gray shirt and cheap, worn-out sweatpants that hung loosely on her thinning frame. Her hair was tied back in a messy, chaotic knot, strands clinging to her forehead with sweat. Her hands were encased in thick, yellow rubber gloves, and she was scrubbing the grout between the marble tiles with a desperate, frantic energy. She looked utterly exhausted. The dark, heavy circles under her eyes were visible even from across the room. Her shoulders were slumped, completely devoid of the proud, confident posture she used to carry. She did not look like the wealthy wife of a successful technology executive living in a mansion her father bought free and clear. She looked like an indentured servant trapped in a relentless, exhausting cycle of domestic servitude. Before I could even speak her name, a shrill, piercing voice echoed down from the second-floor landing. It was Beverly. The sound of her arrogant, demanding tone sent a visible physical shudder down Melanie's spine. Melanie Beverly shouted from the upstairs hallway, her voice dripping with sharp, impatient venom. "I told you 20 minutes ago that the guest room needs to be completely sanitized. And my imported silk sheets need to be ironed immediately. Not steamed ironed. The last time you did them, they were full of creases, and I simply cannot sleep on wrinkled silk. Do you hear me? I need them crisp before my afternoon nap. Melanie flinched, stopping her scrubbing for a brief second. Yes, Beverly, she called back, her voice incredibly small, trembling with a pathetic submission that absolutely shattered my heart. I will be right up. I am just finishing the kitchen floor. Well, hurry up. Beverly snapped back, her heavy footsteps echoing as she paced the hardwood floor above. I am not running a charity here. Derek works too hard for you to be lounging around doing everything at a snail's pace. I stood frozen in the hallway, my blood running completely cold. I had purchased this house. I had handed over the literal fruits of 40 years of manual labor to ensure my daughter was the undisputed queen of her own castle. And instead, she had been entirely stripped of her power, relegated to the role of a terrified maid, serving a wicked, demanding tyrant. Melanie wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, letting out a ragged, exhausted sigh. She turned her head to reach for the bucket of soapy water, and that was when she saw me standing in the doorway. The mop brush slipped from her gloved hands, clattering loudly against the marble floor. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated panic. All the color drained instantly from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She scrambled to her feet, nearly slipping on the wet tiles, and rushed toward me with frantic, desperate steps. "Dad!" she hissed, keeping her voice to a frantic whisper, checking over her shoulder to make sure Beverly was not coming down the stairs. "What are you doing here? You cannot be here right now. You have to leave." I looked down at her shaking hands, at the cheap, stained clothes she was wearing. "I brought a toy for Leo," I said, my voice steady, though a furious fire was beginning to burn deep in my chest. "I just wanted to drop it off and see my grandson." "No, you have to go," Melanie pleaded, grabbing my forearm with her wet, rubber-covered hands. She was trying to physically push me back toward the front door. "If Beverly sees you, she is going to lose her mind. She is already furious about last night. Derek told me you ruined the dinner and caused a massive scene. He said if you ever came back here, he would make sure we moved to another state. Please, Dad, do not make this worse for me. I cannot handle Derek being angry today." I stared at my daughter, feeling a profound, crushing sorrow. She had been completely brainwashed, entirely isolated, and mentally battered into absolute submission. She was terrified of her husband, terrified of his mother, and living in constant paralyzing fear in a house that I had bought and paid for. "Melanie," I said softly, refusing to move an inch. "Why are you scrubbing the floors? You are supposed to have a cleaning service. Derek makes more than enough money to hire help. Why is his mother treating you like a servant in your own home?" Melanie shook her head, tears instantly welling up in her terrified eyes. "We had to let the cleaning service go," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her hidden shame. "Derek is just reallocating funds for the business right now. It is only temporary. Beverly is just trying to teach me how to maintain a proper household." "Please, Dad, do not ask questions. You do not understand the pressure Derek is under. If you love me, you will walk out that door right now before she comes downstairs." She was trapped in a powerful, suffocating delusion, defending the very monsters who were actively destroying her life. She was willing to endure constant humiliation to protect the fragile fake reality Derek had constructed. But I was not going to play along anymore. I was not going to retreat into the shadows while my daughter was worked to the bone. Before I could formulate a response that would not completely break her fragile emotional state, a sudden sharp wail erupted from the adjoining family room. It was Leo. My grandson was crying, his loud, distressed sobs cutting through the tense, heavy atmosphere of the kitchen. Melanie gasped, her motherly instincts instantly overriding her panic. She dropped her hands from my arm and spun around, her eyes darting toward the sound. "Oh God, he woke up early. He is teething. He is so fussy today," she muttered frantically, tearing off the thick yellow rubber gloves and tossing them onto the wet counter. "Dad, stay right here. Do not make a sound. Let me just calm him down and then I will walk you out. Please, just stay put." She did not wait for my answer. She sprinted out of the kitchen, her bare feet padding softly against the hardwood as she rushed into the family room to tend to the crying toddler. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to her soft, soothing murmurs as she tried to quiet my grandson. I looked down at the wooden fire truck I was still gripping tightly in my right hand. I set it down gently on the pristine granite countertop. I had brought the toy as an alibi, but I no longer needed an excuse. The time for hiding for playing the clueless, accommodating father-in-law was officially over. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cold, hard resolve settle firmly into my bones. Melanie had told me to stay put. She had begged me to hide so I would not upset the delicate balance of her miserable, enslaved existence. But I did not spend my entire life building foundations just to watch someone else tear my family apart. I turned away from the kitchen. I moved with slow, silent, deliberate steps, my heavy work boots making absolutely no sound on the expensive rugs lining the hallway. I slipped past the open doorway of the family room, ignoring my daughter's frantic attempts to soothe her crying child. My eyes were fixed dead ahead, locked onto the sweeping, majestic curve of the grand staircase. I walked past the foyer, gripping the polished oak handrail. I placed my foot on the first carpeted step, then the next, moving entirely undetected. I was ascending directly into the vulture's nest, walking silently up the grand staircase toward the master suite, ready to confront the rot exactly where it lived. I reached the top of the grand staircase, my heavy work boots sinking soundlessly into the thick plush carpet of the second-floor landing. The air up here was entirely different from the rest of the house. Downstairs smelled of harsh industrial bleach and Melanie's exhausted labor, but the upper hallway was suffocated by the heavy cloying scent of expensive floral perfume. It was Beverly's signature fragrance hanging in the stagnant air like a toxic cloud. The layout of the house I had purchased for my daughter was simple. To the left were the guest rooms, the small home office, and the nursery where my grandson slept. To the right, at the very end of the long sunlit corridor, stood the massive double doors of the master suite. Those were the doors I had walked through 2 years ago, when I proudly handed Derek and Melanie the keys to their new life. One of those heavy wooden doors was pushed slightly ajar, casting a narrow sliver of warm golden light across the dark hallway floor. I moved toward it, pressing my broad back against the cool wall, calculating every single step to ensure the hardwood floorboards beneath the carpet did not betray my presence with a sudden creak. I reached the edge of the ornate doorframe, held my breath, and slowly leaned forward to peek through the narrow opening. What I saw completely defied all logic. My brain struggled to process the sheer scale of the chaotic, indulgent madness spilling across the massive room. This was supposed to be Melanie and Derek's private sanctuary, the master suite with its vaulted ceilings, custom mahogany furniture, and sweeping views of the manicured estate. It was not their room anymore. Beverly Stanton had completely commandeered the largest, most luxurious space in the entire house. But she had not just moved her belongings into the room. She had turned the pristine suite into an absolute hoarding nightmare of unrestrained gluttony. The California king-sized bed was completely buried under a mountain of expensive garments. Silk dresses, imported cashmere sweaters, and heavy velvet coats were tossed haphazardly across the mattress, most of them still bearing their heavy, dangling retail price tags. The expensive hardwood floor was practically invisible, covered entirely by a chaotic labyrinth of high-end retail boxes. Hundreds of them. Matte black Prada boxes, bright green Rolex cases, and thick textured Gucci bags were stacked precariously against the painted walls like bricks in a fortress of absolute greed. Pairs of designer shoes with distinctive red soles were tossed carelessly into the corners, mixed with scattered velvet pouches, spilling sparkling heavy jewelry onto the expensive Persian rugs. It was the lair of a parasite, a dragon's hoard accumulated by a woman who had contributed absolutely nothing to the creation of this wealth. I stared at the towering piles of unopened merchandise, thinking of my daughter downstairs, my sweet Melanie wearing cheap faded sweatpants and scrubbing the kitchen floors with cracked rubber gloves. Melanie had been pushed out of her own bedroom, relegated to some lesser corner of the house so her mother-in-law could build a monument to her own grotesque vanity. The sheer, overwhelming volume of the merchandise was sickening, but it was the manic, desperate energy in the room that finally caught my complete attention and anchored me to the spot. Beverly walked into my narrow line of sight, pacing frantically back and forth across the small patch of floor that was not completely covered in luxury shopping bags. She did not look like the arrogant, impeccably groomed socialite who had sneered at me in the steakhouse the night before. Her heavy makeup was smeared beneath her eyes, giving her a hollow, ghostly appearance. She was clutching her cell phone to her ear with both hands, her knuckles stark white from the immense pressure. She was wearing a thick silk robe, but she was shivering, pacing with the erratic, jerky movements of a cornered, terrified animal. She was speaking rapidly into the phone, her voice stripped of its usual haughty, commanding resonance. It was replaced by a raw, pleading desperation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I remained perfectly still, pressing my shoulder against the doorframe, listening to every single word spilling from her mouth. "Listen to me," Beverly hissed into the phone, her voice shaking with a terrifying, unhinged panic. "I told you you have to give me until the end of the week. You cannot send those people to the house. Do you hear me? If my son finds out you sent collectors to the front door, the entire arrangement falls apart." The voice on the line was muffled, but the harsh, demanding tone was unmistakable. It was not the polite voice of a bank teller or a standard credit card representative. It possessed a heavy, menacing cadence that commanded absolute submission. Beverly stopped pacing, freezing in the middle of the room. She ran a frantic hand through her messy hair, her breathing growing shallow and ragged. She looked like a woman who knew she was running entirely out of time. "I know what the deadline was," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the intense pressure of the conversation. "But I am telling you, the money is coming. The old man is going to wire us $50,000 by Friday. Just hold off the collectors for a few more days. Derek is handling the idiot right now. He is at his cabin. He will get the cash. He always gets the cash from him. Just tell your boss to freeze the interest until Friday. I swear on my life you will have your payment in full." She lowered the phone slowly from her ear, her chest heaving as the line went dead. She let out a wretched, sobbing gasp, collapsing onto the edge of the mattress, sinking into a pile of expensive silk garments. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the terrifying reality of her situation crushed her. I stood frozen, my chest rising and falling, with slow, deliberate breaths. The idiot. The clueless old man. She was talking about me. She was talking about the temporary $50,000 bridge loan Derek had just begged me for on my front porch less than an hour ago. The shattered puzzle pieces snapped together with a brutal, blinding clarity. Derek had not asked for that money to save his phantom tech startup. He had not asked for it to make payroll for 40 imaginary employees. He had rushed to my cabin at the crack of dawn, playing the role of the desperate, hard-working executive, simply to extort his father-in-law for $50,000 to keep the violent debt collectors away from his mother. Beverly Stanton was not merely an arrogant snob who enjoyed fine dining and belittling the working class. She was a deeply sick, degenerate addict. The mountains of unopened luxury boxes, the manic pacing, the panicked pleading on the phone, the mysterious, massive commercial liens placed against the house I had purchased. It all made perfect, terrifying sense now. Beverly had a crippling gambling and shopping addiction that was bleeding their entire family dry. She was borrowing money from dangerous, unregulated sources, people who did not care about credit scores or corporate titles, shadow lenders who sent enforcers to the front door when payments were missed. And Derek, the supposedly brilliant, untouchable chief executive officer, was nothing more than an accomplice. He was actively draining my life savings, sacrificing my daughter's dignity, and manipulating me at every single turn just to pay off his mother's ruthless creditors. He was burning down the fortress I had built for his wife and child just to keep his mother from facing the brutal consequences of her own destructive vices. The burning anger that had propelled me to the house vanished, replaced entirely by a freezing, absolute resolve. They had turned my daughter into a maid. They had used my grandson as a weapon over a restaurant bill. They had mocked my dead wife and called me an idiot while actively plotting to steal my retirement savings to feed a criminal debt. I did not move. I did not make a single sound. I backed away from the heavy wooden door, turning my gaze away from the pathetic weeping woman in the master suite. I knew exactly what was rotting beneath the beautiful floorboards now. The house was not just mortgaged. It was a collateral hostage to a criminal underworld, and my entire family was trapped inside it. I was the one who bought the land, poured the concrete, and owned the deed to their fraudulent lives. I retreated silently down the long carpeted hallway. I was going to let them think the old man was fetching their money. And then I was going to tear their entire world apart, piece by piece, brick by stolen brick. I retreated from the heavy wooden door of the master suite, stepping backward with the precision of a man walking across a steel beam suspended 50 stories in the air. Every muscle in my body was tight, controlling my movements to ensure the floorboards beneath the thick carpet did not let out a single creak. The sound of Beverly weeping inside the bedroom was quickly muffled as I put distance between myself and her toxic sanctuary. I reached the end of the upstairs hallway, bypassing the main sweeping staircase I had used to ascend. I moved toward the narrow servant stairs tucked away behind a discreet wooden door near the laundry room. It was a passage designed for the hired help to move silently through the massive house without disturbing the wealthy owners. Given how they treated my daughter, it was a fitting route. I walked down the steep, dimly lit steps, the harsh smell of industrial bleach growing stronger with every stride. The narrow staircase deposited me directly into the shadows of the massive kitchen. The cavernous room was completely empty. I could hear the faint sounds of a television playing a children's cartoon from the adjoining family room. Melanie was still in there, her exhausted voice trying to coax my teething grandson into a state of calm. She had no idea I was still inside the house. She had no idea her father had just uncovered the rotting, cancerous truth actively destroying her life. I stood near the granite island, preparing to slip out the heavy glass back door leading to the driveway. But as my eyes scanned the sterile environment, they locked onto a piece of modern machinery tucked away in the corner beneath a desk. It was a high-capacity commercial paper shredder. Derek had insisted on buying it, claiming a successful technology executive needed secure document disposal for his highly sensitive corporate contracts. The black plastic bin beneath the metal teeth was filled to the absolute brim. It was overflowing, a chaotic mound of paper strips spilling out onto the polished marble tiles. A desperate man trying to hide his financial ruin does not carelessly throw away junk mail. He destroys the evidence. I walked over to the desk, keeping my ears trained on Melanie's voice in the next room. I knelt on the cold floor and reached my scarred hands into the overflowing plastic bin. I bypassed the top layer of confetti and dug deep into the center, pulling out 2 tightly packed handfuls of continuous paper strips. I shoved the shredded documents deep into the interior pockets of my heavy canvas jacket, packing them tight until my pockets bulged with the evidence. I stood up, gave the kitchen one final sweeping glance, and quietly unlocked the back door. I stepped out into the crisp, damp morning air, pulling the door completely shut behind me with a soft, barely audible click. I walked down the sweeping concrete driveway, my boots crunching softly against the scattered autumn leaves. I climbed into the cold, familiar cabin of my battered Ford truck, shoved the key into the ignition, and started the engine. I did not drive all the way back to the deep woods of my property. I only drove 3 blocks down the street, pulling over into a secluded, heavily shaded parking spot, alongside a sprawling neighborhood park. I turned off the engine, leaving the truck in complete silence. The rain had started to fall again, tapping a steady, rhythmic beat against the metal roof. I unzipped my canvas jacket and reached deep into the interior pockets. I pulled out the tightly packed handfuls of shredded paper and dumped them onto the wide expanse of my dashboard. Hundreds of thin, jagged strips scattered across the dark plastic surface. To an ordinary person, it would look like an impossible, frustrating mess, a chaotic pile of garbage destined for a landfill. But I was not an ordinary person. I was a master contractor. I had spent 4 entire decades looking at scattered piles of raw lumber, twisted steel, and broken concrete, envisioning exactly how the disparate pieces fit together to create a solid, weight-bearing structure. I reached into my glove compartment, pulled out a roll of transparent packing tape, and got to work. I spent the next hour sitting hunched over the steering wheel, completely ignoring the painful, dull ache settling into my lower back. My large, calloused fingers worked with a surprising, delicate precision, sorting the jagged strips of paper by the subtle variations in font size, margin width, and the faint blue ink of a corporate letterhead. It was a painstaking, methodical process. I matched a broken syllable here, a severed numerical digit there. I taped the fragile pieces together against the smooth surface of the dashboard, slowly rebuilding the destroyed document from the ground up. Line by line, the chaotic puzzle began to reveal its dark, terrifying picture. It was not a venture capital contract. It was not a technology startup agreement. It was a formal, legally binding contract from a shadow financial institution, a high-interest predatory lending group known for operating in the murky, dangerous gray areas of the law. The header was stark and uncompromising, stamped with a bold, aggressive font that demanded immediate attention. The document was a formal notice of default, a ruthless ultimatum delivered to a man who had completely exhausted every single legitimate avenue of credit available to him. I smoothed down the final piece of transparent tape, securing the last jagged strip into place. I leaned back against the headrest, my breathing shallow and tight, and read the reconstructed document from top to bottom. The terms laid out on the taped paper were absolutely brutal, designed entirely to trap a desperate borrower in an inescapable cycle of crushing, suffocating debt. The principal amount borrowed was staggering, and the compounding interest rate was predatory, a mathematical death sentence that guaranteed the balance would never actually be paid off. My eyes scanned down to the highlighted, bolded paragraph near the bottom of the page. It was the formal demand for payment. The shadow lenders were not asking for the $50,000 Derek had just begged me for on my front porch. That $50,000 was merely the absolute minimum required to stop the daily harassment, a pathetic offering to keep the violent enforcers away from his mother for just a few more days. The actual immediate demand was far worse. The document explicitly stated that if a lump sum payment of exactly $100,000 was not wired into their designated offshore account, by the last day of the current calendar month, the lenders would execute their right to immediate, devastating legal recourse. I read the next sentence, and the blood in my veins turned completely to ice. The predators had not lent this massive sum of money based on the fabricated success of Derek's non-existent technology company. They were not foolish enough to accept a phantom startup as collateral. They demanded hard, physical, undeniable assets to secure their loan. The document clearly stated that upon default of the $100,000 payment, the lending group would legally seize the Bellevue mansion. They would place an immediate hostile lien against the property, initiating a rapid foreclosure process that would throw my daughter and my innocent grandson out onto the street. The beautiful, sprawling estate I had purchased, with $1.2 million of my own cash, had been secretly pledged as collateral to a syndicate of ruthless loan sharks. But the absolute horror of the situation did not stop there. The final paragraph of the shredded contract contained a detail so profoundly evil, so utterly devoid of basic human morality, that my vision actually blurred with a sudden, overwhelming surge of pure rage. Derek had not just risked the roof over his family's head. He had looked further down the line, ensuring that his own financial ruin would pull me straight down into the abyss alongside him. I stared at the signature line at the very bottom of the taped document. There was Derek's signature, scrawled with his usual arrogant flourish, but right next to it, printed clearly in black ink, was my own name. The contract stated that in the event the seizure of the Bellevue property did not fully cover the outstanding principal, the accumulated interest, and the exorbitant collection penalties, the lenders were legally authorized to target the secondary guarantor. I had never signed this document. I had never spoken to these people, but Derek had forged my signature with meticulous, practiced precision. He had handed my entire life over to criminals. The contract explicitly stated that upon default, the lenders would legally seize my personal lifelong retirement pension fund, which had been formally listed as the primary financial guarantor for his mother's staggering gambling debt. The absolute scale of his betrayal was fully revealed, cementing my path to total war. I stared at the forged signature on the reconstructed contract until the ink seemed to burn into my retinas. The initial shock, the sickening wave of paternal betrayal, completely evaporated. In its place, a freezing, absolute clarity settled deep within my chest. I was done being the accommodating father-in-law. I was done being the quiet, reliable bank for a family of ruthless parasites. I swept the taped pieces of paper off the dashboard, folded the document with meticulous care, and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine of my old Ford truck roared to life, matching the surge of adrenaline pumping through my veins. I pulled out of Bellevue and merged onto the interstate, heading straight for the skyline of downtown Seattle. The rain continued to batter the windshield, but my vision was perfectly clear. I was going to war. And you do not go to war without hiring a mercenary. I navigated the aggressive downtown traffic and pulled into the underground parking garage of a skyscraper. I took the express elevator to the 52nd floor. The polished steel doors glided open, revealing the reception area of Lawson & Associates. Victor Lawson was not a family attorney. He did not handle estate planning. Victor was a ruthless, cutthroat financial bulldog. He was the man wealthy people called when they needed their adversaries utterly destroyed, when they needed assets frozen, hidden offshore accounts exposed, and financial criminals buried under mountains of inescapable litigation. More importantly, Victor owed me a massive, unpayable debt. 20 years ago, before he was a partner in a corner office, he was a struggling junior lawyer, drowning in a construction lawsuit regarding a structurally compromised commercial development. I stepped in, provided the exact structural engineering testimony he needed, and saved his entire career from absolute ruin. I never asked for a single favor in return. Until today. I walked past the sprawling minimalist waiting area and approached the front desk. A young receptionist with sharp glasses and a headset immediately stood up, opening her mouth to ask for my appointment. I did not give her the chance. I bypassed the mahogany desk entirely and walked straight down the long carpeted corridor toward the corner office. I pushed open the heavy oak door without knocking. Victor was sitting behind an enormous mahogany desk surrounded by towering stacks of legal files and glowing computer monitors. He looked up, his initial irritation instantly melting into profound shock as he recognized the man standing in his doorway. He took off his reading glasses, standing up slowly. "Richard," Victor said, his voice carrying a mix of genuine surprise and deep respect. "It has been over a decade. What in the world brings you down here?" I did not exchange pleasantries. I did not ask how his practice was doing. I walked directly to the center of the room, reached into the inner pocket of my canvas jacket, and pulled out the folded, taped-together document. I dropped it flat onto the polished surface of his mahogany desk. The jagged, transparent strips of tape gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of his office. Victor looked down at the shredded paper, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Victor," I said, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I want Derek Stanton and his mother economically vivisected. I want to know where every penny went for the last 3 years." Victor stared at me for a long, silent moment. He could see the absolute gravity in my eyes. He did not ask why I was demanding the financial execution of my own son-in-law. He did not offer any useless, comforting platitudes about family disputes. He simply nodded, sat back down in his high-backed leather chair, and pulled the taped document toward him. He put his reading glasses back on and began to read the terms of the predatory loan. I watched his face closely. Victor was a man who spent his life swimming with the absolute worst sharks in the corporate financial sector. Very little shocked him. But as his eyes scanned down to the bolded demands, the commercial lien placed against the Bellevue mansion, and finally resting on my forged signature, listed as the primary guarantor, his jaw physically tightened. He looked up at me, his expression hardening into a mask of pure professional hostility. "This is not just a bad loan," Richard Victor said, his voice dropping an octave. "This is an active ticking bomb. These specific lenders do not use collection agencies. They use physical enforcement, and this forged signature completely tethers your entire lifelong pension to their criminal enterprise. If we do not sever this connection immediately, they will drain your accounts dry the moment this boy defaults." "Can you trace the money?" I asked, ignoring the panic he was trying to convey. "I need to know exactly how much they have stolen, where it is currently hiding, and what mechanisms we can use to seize it back before the month ends." Victor did not hesitate. He picked up his desk phone, pressed a button, and issued an order to his team of forensic accountants. He told them to drop whatever they were doing and report to the conference room immediately. He looked back at me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a hunt. "Consider it done, Richard. I will deploy my entire team. We will tear down his corporate veil, trace the numbers, and expose every single transaction he has authorized. Go sit in the lobby. Have a coffee. Let me do what I do best." I walked out of his office and returned to the quiet, sterile reception area. The young receptionist offered me a smile and directed me toward a sleek espresso machine in the corner of the room. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, taking a seat in a chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The rain was still coming down in thick gray sheets, obscuring the view of the city below. I sat there in absolute silence, watching the cars moving along the slick streets. I thought about Melanie scrubbing the floors of that mansion on her hands and knees. I thought about my grandson crying in the next room, completely oblivious to the fact that his father had wagered his future on a desperate gamble. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, letting the bitter taste settle on my tongue. I was not going to let them win. I was going to tear Derek Stanton out of my family root and stem. The minutes stretched into an agonizingly slow crawl. The corporate office hummed with a quiet, efficient energy. Associates in sharp suits walked briskly down the hallways carrying thick legal briefs. The receptionist answered a continuous stream of hushed phone calls. I remained perfectly still, watching the hands of the large clock on the wall tick forward. 1 hour passed. Then 2. I did not check my phone. I knew Derek was probably leaving dozens of frantic voicemails demanding his $50,000, wondering why the clueless old man was taking so long at the bank. He was likely pacing the floors of his fake office, completely unaware that a team of ruthless financial bloodhounds was currently ripping through his digital life, exposing every lie, every hidden transaction, and every stolen dollar. As the 3rd hour approached, the heavy oak door leading to the inner offices swung open. I looked up from my empty coffee cup, expecting to see Victor striding out, with a triumphant, predatory smile, holding a stack of actionable evidence that would allow me to crush my son-in-law entirely. But the man who walked out of the corridor did not look triumphant. He did not look like a victorious mercenary, ready to deliver the fatal blow to an enemy. Victor Lawson. A man who regularly dismantled corrupt billionaires and faced down corporate cartels without breaking a single sweat, looked absolutely terrified. His face was completely drained of all color, his skin a sickening pale shade of gray. His silk tie was loosened, and his breathing was shallow and uneven. He was clutching a thin manila folder tightly against his chest, his knuckles white with tension. He walked straight toward me, bypassing the young receptionist entirely. He did not offer a warm, comforting handshake. He did not invite me back to his office with the usual confident swagger of a high-powered attorney. He stopped directly in front of my chair, looking down at me with an expression of profound, unadulterated dread. "Richard." "Come inside right now," Victor said, his voice trembling with a barely contained panic that sent a sudden, violent chill shooting straight down my spine. "We have a massive, life-threatening problem that we must handle today." I followed Victor through the heavy oak doors, the plush carpet absorbing our footsteps. He did not speak as we walked down the corridor. His usual predatory swagger was completely gone. He ushered me into his corner office, closing the door and engaging the heavy deadbolt. He walked to the windows and yanked the blinds shut, plunging the room into artificial light. He moved toward his desk, staring at the floor, as if trying to explain a terminal diagnosis. I stood silently in the center of the room, feeling the cold weight of the shadow loan pressing against my chest. "Sit down, Richard," Victor said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. "Please sit down. We need to go through this methodically, because what my team just uncovered is far worse than a simple predatory loan from a local syndicate." I pulled out a leather chair and sat down. Victor walked to his side of the desk and dropped into his chair. He did not open his laptop. Instead, he reached for a thick manila folder his forensic accountants had just compiled. He opened it slowly, flattening the pages with his hand. He took a deep breath, looking me directly in the eyes. "Derek Stanton does not run a technology startup," Victor stated bluntly. "The company is a complete and absolute fraud. It is a hollow shell corporation registered in Delaware with no proprietary software, no product line, and absolutely zero legitimate revenue streams. He does not actually employ 40 developers. He pays a monthly retainer to a virtual receptionist service, and he leases a temporary shared workspace downtown just to maintain a physical mailing address. The entire operation is a meticulously constructed mirage designed specifically to secure massive, high-value lines of commercial credit." I listened, letting the sheer magnitude of the deception wash over me. The late-night work sessions, Derek complained about the sudden business trips, the frantic calls from angry investors. It was a theatrical performance, an elaborate stage play designed to keep Melanie trapped in awe and keep me writing checks. "But the bank gave him a $2.5 million commercial loan against the house," I said, keeping my voice low. "Banks do not hand out capital without performing due diligence. How did he bypass the underwriters? He falsified his revenue projections and fabricated an entire portfolio of venture capital term sheets," Victor explained, flipping the page. "He used the Bellevue mansion, the massive property you purchased entirely in cash, as collateral. Because the house had zero debt and overwhelming equity, the bank viewed it as an incredibly safe asset. They granted the commercial loan based on the physical equity you provided. But Richard, the moment that $2.5 million hit his corporate account, it did not stay there to fund any legitimate business development whatsoever. It was immediately siphoned out, shattered into dozens of untraceable wire transfers, and funneled directly into shadowy offshore accounts." "Where did it go?" I asked, leaning forward, bracing myself for the reality of my son-in-law's depravity. Victor flipped another page, revealing a spreadsheet covered in highlighted red transactions. It went to feeding a lifestyle they could not afford, and to covering Beverly's catastrophic gambling addiction. My team traced significant portions of the capital to high-stakes underground casinos in Macau, private baccarat tables in Las Vegas, and offshore sports betting syndicates. Beverly Stanton is a compulsive, desperate addict operating at the highest financial stakes, and Derek has been acting as her personal clearinghouse. He used the rest of the funds to lease the Porsche buy tailored suits and hire boutique public relations firms to secure meaningless magazine articles naming him an emerging entrepreneur. He literally bought his entire identity using the equity of the home you purchased for them. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I thought about Melanie scrubbing the marble floors on her hands and knees. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent breathing in concrete dust, destroying my joints, sacrificing my own comfort, just so she could have a sanctuary. And Derek had taken that sanctuary, carved it up into little pieces, and fed it to his mother's underground gambling bookies. "And the shadow loan?" I asked, gesturing to the pocket of my jacket, the shredded document I found in their kitchen. "Where does that fit into this nightmare?" Victor rubbed his temples, his face looking 10 years older than it had an hour ago. "The commercial bank loan ran out 6 months ago," he said grimly. "Once the $2.5 million was gone, they had nothing left to maintain the illusion." So Derek turned to the shadow lenders, unregulated violent syndicates that provide immediate liquidity but charge astronomical daily compounding interest rates. They used those predatory loans simply to cover the monthly minimum payments on their legitimate bank debts, trying to buy themselves just a little more time. It is a classic terminal death spiral, but that is not even the immediate threat. Victor leaned across the desk, lowering his voice to a grave, urgent whisper. Richard, they have not paid a single cent in federal taxes for the last 2 years. Derek has been classifying his personal lifestyle expenses as corporate losses while simultaneously failing to file any legitimate returns for the corporation. The Internal Revenue Service does not move quickly, but when they do, they move with absolute unyielding devastation. The red envelopes you saw in his vehicle were not warnings. They were final notices of intent to levy. The federal government is days away from freezing every single financial account connected to Derek Beverly and the Shell Corporation. The Bellevue Mansion, Victor continued, his voice heavy with finality, is essentially lost to the bank. The moment the federal tax liens are officially recorded, the commercial lenders will trigger an immediate acceleration clause. They will demand the entire $2.5 million balance in full. When Derek inevitably fails to produce that capital, they will foreclose on the property. Melanie and your grandson will be thrown out onto the street, and there is absolutely nothing you or I can do to stop the federal government from taking that house. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the destruction. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously executed, that it almost defied human comprehension. Derek had not just made poor business decisions. He had methodically engineered a financial suicide pact, dragging his wife, his child, and his mother directly into the blast radius. He had traded their future for a fragile illusion of wealth and status. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. My anger vanished, replaced by a chilling determination to survive the coming blast and ensure the guilty parties faced maximum suffering. We will let the house go, I stated evenly, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room. I can buy Melanie a small, safe, quiet apartment under my own name. I will shield her and my grandson from the fallout. Let the federal government and the commercial banks tear Derek and Beverly apart. Let them fight over the scraps of a fake empire. It is no longer my own problem. Victor did not look relieved. He did not nod in agreement. Instead, his pale face drained of more color. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet office. He reached toward the bottom of the folder and pulled out a separate, heavily stamped legal file. It was thick, bound with a blue ribbon, and bore the official insignia of a major banking institution. It was not a document from the shadowy underworld. It was from the legitimate, highly regulated corporate banking sector. Victor placed his hands flat on top of the document. He looked at me with an expression of profound, devastating sorrow. He took a slow, trembling breath before he finally spoke. That is not going to work, Richard. Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. You cannot just walk away from this collapse. You cannot just buy Melanie an apartment and watch them fall, because Derek did not just use the house as collateral. He slowly pushed the heavily stamped legal file across the polished mahogany desk. The thick packet of paper stopped directly in front of my hands. This is the worst part, Richard, Victor said, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrified intensity. I need you to open that file. Look at page 4. I reached out with my scarred hands and pulled the heavy file closer. I flipped past the title page, past the dense pages of banking terms and liability clauses, until I reached the 4th page of the document. I looked down at the signature line at the bottom of the crisp white paper. My heart stopped completely in my chest. Staring back at me, written in bold, undeniable black ink, was my very own signature. I stared at the dark ink forming the letters of my name. It was not a clumsy, hesitant forgery. It was a masterpiece of deception. Derek had studied my handwriting. He had practiced the sharp, aggressive slant of the R, the heavy, deliberate cross of the T, and the trailing, almost illegible curve of the D at the very end. It was the exact signature I had used for 40 years to sign off on massive commercial concrete pours, to authorize payroll for hundreds of union workers, and to sign the mortgage papers on the very first home I ever bought with my late wife. Seeing it duplicated on a document I had never seen before felt like a physical violation a disgusting intrusion into the very core of my identity. I forced my eyes to break away from the fraudulent signature and move up the crisp white page. I read the heavy, dense paragraphs of legal terminology detailing the exact nature of the document. It was a secondary line of credit, an open revolving financial instrument authorized by a major national bank issued for the staggering amount of $800,000. Derek had leveraged the remaining theoretical equity of the Bellevue mansion, combining it with the pristine, unblemished credit score I had meticulously maintained my entire adult life. He had walked into a corporate banking office, smiled his charismatic, fraudulent smile, and walked out with nearly $1 million of liquid capital, all secured entirely by my name. But a bank does not issue an $800,000 line of credit based purely on a good credit score. They require hard, tangible collateral. They require a safety net that guarantees they will recoup their capital if the borrower defaults. I turned the page, the thick paper feeling heavy and toxic between my fingers. I found the collateralization schedule. My breath caught in my throat as I read the itemized list of assets that had been legally pledged to the bank to secure this massive fraudulent loan. Listed on the first line was my cabin. The quiet, secluded piece of property I had bought decades ago, the sanctuary where I had planned to spend my final years in peace. Listed on the second line was the title to my Ford truck, a minor asset to a bank, but a symbol of my independence. And listed on the very last line, securely bound by federal banking regulations, was my personal retirement pension. The pension I had paid into every single week for 40 years. The financial safety net that ensured I would never be a burden to anyone. Derek had pledged all of it. Every single thing I owned in this world had been legally tethered to his catastrophic failure. The sheer breathtaking cowardice of his plan became completely clear. Derek had known his fake technology company was going to collapse. He had known his mother's gambling debts were going to eventually consume them both. And instead of facing the ruin like a man, instead of taking responsibility for the destruction he had caused, he had quietly and methodically built a trapdoor. He had rigged the financial bomb to blow backward. When the offshore accounts ran dry, when the shadow lenders came knocking, and when the bank finally called in the massive commercial loans, Derek was never going to be the one left holding the bag. The bank would not go after a bankrupt, unemployed fraud. They would immediately execute the collateral clauses. They would seize my cabin. They would take my truck. They would freeze my pension account, draining it dry to cover the outstanding balance of the stolen $800,000. Derek had literally rigged the explosive to decimate my life so he could walk away from the blast radius completely unharmed. Victor broke the suffocating silence in the office. He leaned across the polished mahogany desk, his face pale, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate urgency. "Richard, you have to listen to me right now," Victor said, his voice sharp and commanding, slipping seamlessly into the role of a crisis attorney. "You need to pull out your phone and dial the Seattle field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. We have to report this forgery today. We need to file a formal identity theft report with the local police, and we need to get ahead of the federal prosecutors. If we do not report this crime before the bank triggers the default, you become a co-conspirator in the eyes of the federal government. You have to hand Derek over to the authorities right now." I continued staring at the forged signature on the paper. The idea of picking up the phone and calling the authorities felt entirely logical to a lawyer. It was the correct legal and formal procedure. But I was not a lawyer. I was a man who understood how the real world operated beneath the polished surface of courtrooms and banking institutions. I slowly closed the heavy legal file. I squared the edges of the paper, aligning them perfectly on the desk. I looked up at Victor, my expression completely devoid of panic. "I am not calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation," I stated calmly. Victor stared at me as if I had suddenly lost my mind. "Richard, are you listening to what I am saying? He committed federal wire fraud. He committed grand larceny. He forged a signature to defraud a federally insured banking institution out of almost $1 million. If you do not call the authorities, they will seize everything you own. You will be left with absolutely nothing. You will be homeless. If I call the federal government, I replied, my voice remaining perfectly, even the bank will immediately freeze all of my accounts, pending a massive multi-year investigation. The federal prosecutors will lock down my pension while they verify that I was not a willing participant in the fraud. Do you know how long it takes for a federal banking investigation to clear a name, Victor? 3 years, maybe 5. In the meantime, I have no access to my own money. I have no way to pay the property taxes on my cabin. I starve while a dozen lawyers argue in a courtroom over jurisdictional technicalities. I will not surrender my life to a bureaucracy that does not care if I live or die. But you cannot just let him get away with this, Victor argued, leaning back in his chair, running a trembling hand over his face. You cannot just absorb an $800,000 fraudulent debt. It will destroy you. I am not going to absorb it, I said, leaning forward, resting my scarred hands flat against the cool surface of his mahogany desk. And I am certainly not going to let him get away with it. But I am not going to hand him over to the federal government so he can negotiate a plea deal and serve 3 years in a minimum security white-collar resort. No, I am going to bury them myself. Victor blinked clearly, taken aback by the absolute freezing conviction in my voice. How he asked, his professional curiosity battling with his legal caution. How do you intend to fight a federal banking institution and a syndicate of predatory shadow lenders without involving the authorities? You are going to create a blind, anonymous, limited liability company for me, I instructed, laying out the blueprint for the demolition. I want it registered in Delaware by the end of business today. I want it structured with absolute impenetrable anonymity. Use nominee directors and registered agents. No one, not the federal government, not the commercial banks, and certainly not Derek Stanton, should ever be able to trace the ownership of that company back to my name. Victor reached for a legal pad, his pen hovering over the blank paper. I can establish the corporate entity within 4 hours. The Delaware registry offers complete privacy, but an empty corporate shell does not solve the immediate financial threat, Richard. What exactly do you intend to do with this company? Years ago, long before Melanie met Derek, I oversaw the concrete foundation pouring for a massive commercial high-rise project downtown. The developer was highly motivated to finish ahead of schedule, and he offered a massive off-the-books performance bonus. I never told anyone about that money, not even Melanie. I placed it in a series of municipal bonds and high-yield, incredibly quiet investment accounts. It was my absolute last resort, a hidden financial fortress designed for a catastrophic emergency. That emergency had officially arrived. I am going to drain my remaining secret investments, I told Victor, watching his eyes widen in realization. I am going to liquidate the municipal bonds. I will wire the entire balance directly into the corporate operating account of the new Delaware company you are going to establish. And then what? Victor asked, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. And then I said, a cold, ruthless smile finally breaking across my face. Your firm is going to reach out to the predatory lending group that holds Beverly's debt. You are going to contact the shadow lenders who currently possess the commercial lien against the Bellevue mansion. You are going to act as the legal representative of a highly motivated, anonymous private equity firm. Victor stopped writing. He looked at me, his mouth slightly open, as the sheer terrifying magnitude of my strategy finally dawned on him. You want to buy the paper? He whispered, staring at me in absolute shock. You want to purchase their debt. I do not want to just purchase it, I corrected him, my voice turning into a dark, unforgiving promise. I want to own it entirely. I want you to buy their high-interest loans directly from the shadow lenders. I want you to acquire every single cent of Beverly Stanton's gambling debt. I want the Delaware company to hold the primary lien on the Bellevue mansion. Derek and Beverly think they are running from faceless, violent predators. They think they can manipulate an old man to save themselves. They have absolutely no idea that I am about to become the executioner standing in the shadows. I will become their sole, absolute creditor. I will hold the deed to their fraudulent lives. And when the time is right, I will personally pull the floorboards out from underneath them. Victor sat in stunned silence, processing the sheer brutality of the counterattack. It was a maneuver so aggressive, so utterly devoid of traditional legal caution, that it bordered on financial warfare. Buying distressed predatory debt from unregulated lenders was an incredibly dangerous game. It required massive amounts of liquid capital and an absolute willingness to operate in the darkest, most unforgiving corners of the financial sector. You are talking about wiring millions of dollars to people who operate completely outside the boundaries of the law. Victor warned his legal instincts, making one final attempt to bring me back to conventional reasoning. These shadow lenders will demand a premium to sell their paper. They know they hold a highly leveraged asset in that Bellevue property. It will consume every last cent of your secret reserves. If this fails, Richard, you will not just lose your pension to the bank. You will lose your hidden wealth as well. You will be left with nothing but the clothes on your back. I have spent my entire life building things from nothing. I replied, my gaze never leaving his. I know how to pour a foundation, and I know how to swing a sledgehammer. Derek Stanton thought he could use my name to shield himself from the consequences of his own pathetic, arrogant failures. He thought he could rig a bomb to destroy my future while he walked away clean. He vastly underestimated the man he was stealing from. I do not care if it takes every last cent I have hidden away. I do not care what premium the shadow lenders demand to sell the paper. I stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my suit jacket, just as I had done in the steakhouse the night before. But I was no longer a humiliated old man walking away from a ruined birthday dinner. I was a man who had just taken absolute control of the battlefield. Draft the operating agreement for the Delaware company, I commanded, my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate or hesitation. Liquidate my municipal bonds immediately. By Monday morning, I want my anonymous corporation to officially own the absolute entirety of their miserable existence. Derek wanted to play with fire. It is time to let him burn. I walked out of Victor Lawson's office and stepped into the elevator, the heavy steel doors closing on the frantic energy of his legal team. The descent to the ground floor felt entirely different from my arrival. I was no longer a victim reacting to a sudden crisis. I was the architect of a demolition. Before Victor could execute the takeover, we faced a critical blind spot. I knew the predatory loan existed. I had pieced together the shredded demands. But the taped document had not explicitly named the shadow institution holding the debt. The letterhead was deliberately obscure, using a generic moniker designed to shield the true operators from federal scrutiny. If Victor was going to buy their paper by Monday morning, we needed the exact specific name of the syndicate. And there was only one person arrogant and desperate enough to simply hand me that information. I stepped out of the skyscraper into the cold, relentless Seattle rain. I walked down the block to a quiet, empty coffee shop. I ordered a black coffee, took a seat in a secluded corner booth, and pulled out my cell phone. I needed to prepare myself. I had to completely suppress the freezing rage currently pulsing through my veins. I had to bury the image of Melanie scrubbing floors and the memory of my forged signature. I had to transform myself back into the pathetic, clueless old man they all believed me to be. I took a deep, steadying breath, found Beverly Stanton in my contact list, and pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. I could hear the sharp clinking of heavy jewelry and the faint, chaotic noise of daytime television in the background. "Yes," Beverly answered, her voice dripping with an immediate defensive hostility. "Who is this?" "It is Richard," I said, keeping my voice intentionally soft, injecting a slight trembling hesitation into my words. "I am calling to speak with you, Beverly." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I could practically see her stiffen her posture, shifting into a stance of absolute venomous superiority. "Richard, what absolute audacity you have calling my private number after the horrific, degrading spectacle you caused last night. Do you have any idea how much damage you did to my social standing?" I closed my eyes, forcing my voice to remain small and entirely submissive. "I know, Beverly. I know, and that is exactly why I am calling you today. I wanted to formally apologize. I was completely out of line at the steakhouse. I am just an old construction worker, and sometimes I forget my place. I was defensive and proud, and I let my own insecurities ruin what should have been a beautiful evening for you and Derek. I am deeply, truly sorry for embarrassing you in front of your peers. The line went silent for a few seconds. I knew exactly what was happening in her mind. Beverly Stanton was a woman whose entire existence was fueled by the subjugation of others. Hearing a man she despised completely surrender and validate her overwhelming ego was a narcotic she simply could not resist. Her breathing slowed. The hostility in her tone was replaced by a smooth, triumphant condescension. "Well," she said, dragging out the word with a theatrical sigh, "I suppose it takes a certain amount of character to admit your profound social failings. Derek was absolutely furious with you, Richard. We both were. We were discussing cutting off all contact with you entirely to protect Leo from your toxic influence." I let out a carefully orchestrated sigh of relief. "Please, Beverly, do not do that. I love my grandson, and I want to make things right." Derek came to visit me at my cabin this morning. He told me about his business struggles. He mentioned that he needed a $50,000 bridge loan to cover payroll because his venture capital funds are tied up in international escrow. Beverly scoffed softly. "Oh yes, the venture capital. Derek works far too hard carrying the entire weight of this family on his shoulders. He should not have to come begging to you for pennies. He only did it because the timing was utterly inconvenient." I leaned forward over the small cafe table. "That is exactly what I wanted to discuss with you, Beverly. I thought about the $50,000 he asked for. And frankly, considering the scale of his technology company and the lifestyle you all maintain, $50,000 feels like a drop in the bucket. It feels like a temporary bandage rather than a real solution." I heard the faint rustle of silk through the phone. Beverly had stopped moving. I had her complete, undivided attention. "What are you saying, Richard?" she asked, her voice tight with a sudden, desperate curiosity. "I am saying that I have been reevaluating my own financial portfolio." I continued smoothing out my tone to sound like a man eagerly trying to buy his way back into a family's good graces. "I have a significant amount of liquid capital sitting in low-yield municipal bonds. I do not want to just hand Derek $50,000 to pay some random employees. I want to make a real substantial contribution to the family. And Derek told me something fascinating today. He mentioned that you were looking to expand your high-end interior design business." I let the lie hang in the air. Beverly did not have a legitimate interior design business. She occasionally bought overpriced furniture with stolen money and called herself a consultant to her wealthy friends. But framing it as a legitimate enterprise was the ultimate bait for her crippling vanity. "Yes," Beverly said quickly, the greed instantly bleeding into her voice. "Yes, my design firm. I have been fielding requests from several elite clients in the Bellevue area, but I simply have not had the liquid capital to secure the imported materials necessary for that caliber of work." "Exactly," I said, smiling coldly into my coffee cup. "I want to fund that expansion, Beverly. I want to invest $500,000 directly into your design business." I pulled the phone away from my ear for a fraction of a second. I could hear Beverly actually gasp. $500,000 was a staggering sum. To a desperate addict facing violent debt collectors, it was a miraculous divine intervention. It was more than enough to cover the looming shadow loan default, and it left hundreds of thousands to feed her insatiable gambling habit. "Richard." She breathed, her voice trembling with an uncontrolled, euphoric, manic energy. "Are you serious? You are talking about a $500,000 investment." "I am completely serious," I assured her. "I want to wire the funds by Monday. I just need to know that this money will actually help you build your business and that it will not just get absorbed by Derek's corporate expenses. I want this to be your money, Beverly." The hook was set. The bait was swallowed whole. The sheer, overwhelming greed entirely overrode whatever tiny shred of caution or suspicion she might have possessed. Her massive ego could not fathom that the clueless, apologetic old man was currently executing a flawlessly designed interrogation. "Oh, Richard, you have absolutely no idea." Beverly laughed. It was a harsh, erratic sound practically vibrating with relief. "This changes everything. You do not need to worry about Derek's expenses. This capital will stay entirely with me. I can finally clear the board. I can finalize the imported textile orders, and more importantly, I can finally pay off the absolute animals over at Blackwood Capital. I will be completely free of them by Tuesday." The name hung in the air. Blackwood Capital. There it was. The shadow institution holding the deed to my daughter's misery. I kept my voice perfectly steady. "Blackwood Capital. Are they a supply vendor for your design firm?" Yes, just a terribly aggressive supply vendor." Beverly lied effortlessly, her tone dismissive and arrogant, now that she believed she had secured the funds. "They provided some bridge financing for a massive project, and they have been absolutely wretched about the repayment terms. But with your $500,000, I will wipe out their balance and never deal with their low-class management again." "You are doing a wonderful thing, Richard. I suppose I can forgive your behavior at the restaurant. I will tell Derek to call off the restraining order against Leo." "That is very generous of you, Beverly," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, deadly calm. "I will make sure Blackwood Capital gets exactly what they are owed." Sure. I pulled the phone away from my face and pressed the red button to end the call. The cafe around me was completely quiet. The rain continued to wash down the large glass windows, blurring the busy Seattle streets outside. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for the deception. I had played her perfectly, utilizing her own grotesque vanity and boundless greed to extract the exact piece of information I needed to initiate her total destruction. I picked up my coffee, took one final satisfying sip, and opened my contact list again. I selected Victor Lawson's direct line and pressed dial. He answered on the very first ring, the background noise of his office indicating his forensic team was already moving at full speed. Richard Victor said, his tone sharp and ready. "Tell me you have something we can use." I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, ruthless expression of absolute certainty. "I have the name of her loan sharks," I told him, my voice echoing with a dark, unforgiving authority. "The syndicate holding the commercial lien is called Blackwood Capital." I paused, letting the name settle into the mind of the most aggressive financial attorney in the city. "Buy the paper, Victor. Buy it all. Contact Blackwood Capital before the sun goes down today. I do not care what premium they demand. I do not care what it costs to expedite the transfer of those assets. I want my anonymous corporation to hold every single cent of their debt. I want to own their souls by Monday." The following 7 days were a blur of relentless high-stakes financial maneuvering. I remained secluded in my quiet wooden cabin, but my mind was firmly planted in the sleek, glass-paneled skyscrapers of downtown Seattle. Victor Lawson moved with the terrifying speed and surgical precision of a seasoned apex predator. By Monday afternoon, his legal team had officially registered the anonymous holding company in the state of Delaware. The corporate shield they constructed was utterly impenetrable. I was a ghost in the machine, entirely insulated from public records. On Tuesday morning, I drove into town and sat across from a terrified branch manager at my local bank. I authorized the complete and total liquidation of my secret municipal bonds. I watched a lifetime of hidden labor, the physical toll of decades poured into concrete and steel, vanish from my personal ledger and transfer directly into the operating account of the new corporate entity. I was pushing all my chips into the absolute center of the table. Victor contacted Blackwood Capital on Wednesday. As predicted, the shadow lenders were initially hostile and highly suspicious. They did not want to sell a debt secured by a massive multi-million-dollar property in the most exclusive suburb of Bellevue. They knew they had Derek trapped, and they fully intended to squeeze him until his bones cracked and the house fell into their hands. But Victor was a ruthless negotiator. He offered them a sudden cash premium that appealed directly to their base criminal greed. He leveraged their desire for immediate clean liquid capital against the long-drawn-out legal hassle of foreclosing on a primary residence. He negotiated a complete buyout that transferred not only Beverly's staggering gambling debts, but also the primary commercial lien on the mansion itself. By Friday evening, the heavy ink was dry. The massive wire transfers successfully cleared the complicated international banking hurdles. The transaction was absolute, legally binding, and completely irreversible. I sat alone in my dark living room, staring at the printed confirmation documents Victor had sent to my cabin by secure courier. The thick paper felt incredibly heavy in my scarred hands. I read the complex legal clauses that transferred financial rights and the absolute power now legally vested in my anonymous company. I had actually done it. I was no longer the discarded, disrespected father-in-law who could be banished from a restaurant. I was the sole absolute creditor to the Stanton family. I owned their massive mortgage. I owned their predatory shadow loans. I held the keys to their entire existence in the palm of my hand. I had become the reaper standing silently in the dark, patiently waiting for the harvest to begin. The sheer beauty of the trap was their complete, blinding ignorance. Derek and Beverly had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had fundamentally shifted. To maintain the illusion and draw them deeper into the snare, Victor, acting as the representative for my anonymous firm, had sent a formal legal notice to Derek's fake corporate office. The notice officially informed him that his commercial debts and his mother's shadow loans had been consolidated and acquired by a new private equity group. I explicitly instructed Victor to include a clause granting them a temporary 30-day extension on the looming default deadlines. The moment that official notice arrived, the suffocating panic radiating from the Bellevue mansion vanished, replaced instantly by a wave of intoxicating, arrogant relief. I knew this because Melanie called me on Saturday afternoon. Her voice sounded dramatically lighter, completely devoid of the frantic weeping terror I had witnessed in her kitchen just days prior. She told me Derek had successfully negotiated a massive restructuring deal with a new powerful investment firm. She proudly relayed that Beverly was in remarkably high spirits, having secured a mysterious extension on her interior design inventory payments. They truly believed they had outsmarted the financial system. They genuinely believed Derek's smooth talking and corporate charisma had saved them from the brink of total annihilation. I listened to my daughter relay these beautiful, tragic lies, keeping my voice perfectly steady and encouraging. I told her I was incredibly happy for them. I told her I always knew Derek would figure everything out. But as I hung up the phone, a cold, heavy sorrow washed over my chest. They were happily celebrating a brief reprieve granted by the very man they had tried to destroy. They were joyfully dancing on the gallows, completely unaware that the executioner had his hand resting firmly on the lever. Their overwhelming arrogance had blinded them to the simple truth that financial predators do not grant extensions out of charity. Predators only retreat to circle the prey before launching the final devastating strike. The following Tuesday, the rain finally stopped, leaving a crisp, biting chill in the air. I walked down the long dirt path leading to my mailbox at the edge of the highway. The morning mist clung to the damp pine needles, casting a quiet gray hue over the surrounding woods. I opened the rusty metal door of the mailbox and pulled out a stack of mundane bills and circulars. But sitting squarely in the middle of the pile was a thick, heavy square of pristine cream cardstock. It felt incredibly dense, smooth, and expensive against my calloused fingertips. I ran my thumb over the surface and felt the raised, textured lettering. I carried it back to the wooden porch, sat heavily in my rocking chair, and carefully broke the dark red wax seal on the back of the envelope. I slid the thick card out into the cool morning air. It was a formal invitation, meticulously embossed with gleaming, reflective gold foil. The ornate cursive script announced a highly exclusive invite-only charity gala. The extravagant event was to be hosted by none other than Beverly Stanton, and it was to be held at the majestic elite Bellevue Country Club. The stated purpose of the gala, printed in bold gold lettering, was to celebrate the extraordinary success and visionary philanthropic efforts of Derek Stanton and his revolutionary technology startup. They had spent thousands of dollars on the invitations alone, opting for custom calligraphy and imported paper stock that screamed of old money and generational wealth. I read the golden words over and over again, my jaw tightening until my back teeth ached. A charity gala. A lavish, spectacularly expensive party designed specifically to showcase their immense wealth and assert their social superiority. They were renting out the most exclusive, expensive country club in the entire state. They were hiring premium caterers, ordering imported champagne, and inviting the absolute upper echelon of Seattle society to witness their fabricated glory. They were throwing a massive celebration to pat themselves on the back for being elite, untouchable titans of industry. It was a staggering display of pathological narcissism, perfectly masking the massive crater of debt hiding just beneath the polished surface. And they were funding this entire grotesque spectacle using the absolute last pennies of their stolen borrowed credit. Because I had granted them a temporary extension on their looming destruction, they interpreted it as a green light to double down on their fake empire. They had not learned a single lesson. They had not taken the reprieve as an opportunity to downsize, apologize, or seek legitimate help. Instead, they were taking the long rope I had given them and wrapping it enthusiastically around their own necks. They were using the temporary breathing room to throw one final desperate masquerade ball. They wanted to bask in the admiration of their peers one last time before the inevitable collapse. I looked at the date printed in shining gold at the very bottom of the heavy card. The lavish gala was explicitly scheduled for this coming Saturday night. They arrogantly expected me to show up dressed in my modest gray suit and sit quietly in a dark corner. They expected me to marvel at their incredible success while they spent the very money they had extorted and stolen from me to build their fake social throne. I slowly stood up from my old rocking chair and stared out at the quiet, steady dripping of the pine trees that surrounded the outer edges of my completely debt-free property. I folded the heavy gold invitation with precise, deliberate movements and slipped it into the breast pocket of my faded flannel shirt. I was absolutely going to attend their beautiful, expensive celebration. I was going to put on a suit, walk through those grand country club doors, and look them right in the eye. But I was not going to sit quietly in the corner like a forgotten relic. I was going to ensure that they paid for every single lie. I was going to bring the entire house down around them, exposing their fraudulent existence to the entire city, and leaving nothing behind but the scattered, broken dust. Saturday evening arrived with a sharp, biting chill hanging over the Seattle skyline. I did not put on my usual faded flannel shirt or my scuffed, heavy work boots. Tonight required a completely different armor. I opened the heavy cedar door of my closet and pulled out a garment bag I had not touched in over a decade. Inside was a bespoke, impeccably tailored black suit I had custom-made in Italy for an international builder conference many years ago. I put on a crisp, starched white shirt, fastening a dark silk tie with deliberate, methodical precision. I polished a pair of heavy black leather Oxford shoes until they reflected the dim light of my cabin bedroom. When I finally stood in front of the full-length mirror, the man staring back at me was not a clueless, accommodating old contractor. The broad shoulders, the scarred hands protruding from expensive silk cuffs, the cold, unyielding stare. I looked like a man who commanded absolute authority. I looked like the man who owned the very ground they were standing on. I picked up my keys, stepped out into the crisp evening air, and drove toward the Bellevue Country Club. The drive was a quiet procession toward the inevitable. The country club was a sprawling, majestic estate hidden behind wrought iron gates and meticulously manicured hedges. As I pulled my battered Ford truck into the sweeping circular driveway, the valet attendants visibly hesitated. They were busy rushing to open the doors of imported sports cars and sleek luxury sedans. One young attendant cautiously approached my window, clearly expecting me to ask for directions because I had made a wrong turn. I handed him the keys and a crisp $50 bill, instructing him to park it right near the front. He nodded silently, his eyes widening at the sharp contrast between the vehicle and the man stepping out of it. I walked up the wide, carpeted stone steps and pushed through the heavy brass and glass doors of the main entrance. The sheer, overwhelming opulence of the grand ballroom hit me immediately. They had spared absolutely no expense using the final dregs of their stolen credit to construct a breathtaking illusion. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, glittering light over the room. Giant ice sculptures carved into the shapes of soaring eagles rested on long, velvet-covered tables. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with delicate caviar appetizers and tall, bubbling flutes of imported vintage champagne. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the absolute elite of Seattle society. I recognized several prominent venture capitalists, high-profile socialites, and local politicians all mingling and laughing, completely unaware that they were currently standing inside a beautifully decorated financial graveyard. I stood near the entrance, a silent, dark silhouette against the glittering backdrop, observing the players on the stage. I spotted Derek near the center of the room. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, laughing loudly at a joke told by a wealthy investor. He looked completely in his element, playing the role of the visionary technology genius to absolute perfection. He was charming them, lying to them, selling them a narrative constructed entirely out of thin air and stolen money. A few feet away, I saw my daughter. Melanie was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald gown that probably cost thousands of dollars, but she looked utterly miserable. She was gripping a glass of water, staring blankly at the floor, offering tight, forced smiles to anyone who approached her. She was a hostage wrapped in silk, and then I saw her. Beverly Stanton was holding court near the main bar, surrounded by a group of wealthy, heavily jeweled women. She was wearing an extravagant diamond necklace and a deeply cut crimson dress, soaking up the attention and admiration of her peers. She was gesturing wildly, boasting about her son's incredible achievements and her own thriving design business. She looked completely triumphant, genuinely believing she had outsmarted the world and secured her place among the untouchable elite. I took a slow, measured step forward, moving away from the shadows of the entrance and stepping directly into the bright, glittering light of the ballroom. I did not rush. I walked with a heavy, deliberate, echoing stride that commanded the space around me. People naturally parted ways as I moved through the crowd, sensing a heavy, dangerous energy that did not belong at a polite charity gala. It took less than a minute for Beverly to notice the shift in the room's atmosphere. She turned her head, a practiced smile on her lips, ready to greet another wealthy admirer. But when her eyes locked onto mine, the smile completely vanished. Her face drained of all color, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated outrage. The wineglass in her hand trembled slightly. She excused herself from her circle of friends with a tight, furious whisper and marched away from the bar. Beverly did not approach me alone. She immediately diverted her path toward the entrance, waving frantically at two massive, broad-shouldered men wearing dark security suits and earpieces. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger in my direction, her face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer panic and intense rage. She was terrified that the clueless old man had shown up to embarrass her, to ruin her perfect night, to shatter the delicate illusion she was fighting so desperately to maintain. She marched back toward me, flanked on either side by the towering security guards. I stopped walking and planted my feet firmly into the thick carpet, waiting for her to close the distance. She stopped just 2 feet away, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a venomous, hateful fire. "What in the world do you think you are doing here?" Beverly hissed, keeping her voice low so the surrounding guests would not hear the venom dripping from her words. "You were explicitly told not to come near my family. You are a cheap, embarrassing old man, and you have absolutely no right to step foot inside this club. This is a private, exclusive event for people who actually matter." I looked down at her, maintaining a cold, unyielding silence. My lack of reaction only infuriated her further. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, her expensive perfume acting like a toxic assault on my senses. "I am not going to let you ruin this night for us," she spat, her voice trembling with barely suppressed hysteria. Derek is about to secure a massive partnership, and I will not have you wandering around like a lost, pathetic beggar, reminding everyone of the trash he married into. You are leaving right now, Richard. You are going to turn around, walk out those doors, and crawl back to your miserable little cabin in the woods. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. You do not have the authority to ask me to leave, Beverly. I said, my voice smooth, deep, and perfectly calm. I have every right to be standing exactly where I am. Beverly let out a sharp, cruel laugh. You really are delusional, she sneered, turning her head to look at the two large security guards standing beside her. She gestured toward me with a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand. Grab him. Grab this pathetic man by his cheap suit and throw him out the back service door. If he resists, call the police and have him arrested for trespassing. I want him gone this instant. The two security guards moved forward simultaneously, their faces set in strict professional compliance. The larger guard, a man with a thick neck and a serious demeanor, reached his heavy hand out toward my shoulder, fully intending to forcefully escort me off the premises. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I simply stood my ground, staring coldly at the man reaching for me. But before his fingers could even graze the fabric of my tailored suit, a sudden sharp burst of static crackled loudly through the clear plastic earpiece coiled around his ear. The guard froze completely in his tracks. His hand hovered just inches away from my shoulder. He pressed his index finger firmly against his earpiece, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He stood perfectly still, listening intently to the frantic, urgent voice speaking directly into his ear from the control room. Beverly crossed her arms impatiently, tapping her designer heel against the floor. "What are you waiting for?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch, drawing the curious stares of a few nearby socialites. "I gave you a direct order. Remove this man immediately." The head security guard did not look at Beverly. He slowly lowered his hand from his earpiece. The strict professional confidence had completely vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of profound, undeniable shock. He looked directly at me, his eyes widening as a profound realization settled over his features. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet tension that had suddenly enveloped our small circle. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, creating a respectful distance between us. He turned his head and looked at Beverly, his expression hardening into a look of cautious fear. "I am sorry, Mom," the head guard said, his voice entirely stripped of the compliance he had shown just moments before. "I cannot do that." Beverly's jaw dropped. She stared at the guard as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. "What do you mean you cannot do that?" she shrieked, her carefully constructed social facade beginning to crack under the immense pressure. "I am the host of this gala. I am telling you that this man is trespassing. Throw him out." The head guard shook his head firmly, taking another step away from her, physically distancing himself from her commands. "He is not trespassing, ma'am," the guard replied, his voice trembling slightly as he glanced nervously back at me. "I just received a direct call from the general manager of the country club. We have been instructed to grant this gentleman absolute unrestricted access to the entire facility." Beverly stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at the guard, then turned her horrified, terrified eyes toward me. The arrogant fire in her gaze was instantly extinguished, replaced by a dark, suffocating shadow of absolute confusion and rising terror. She could not comprehend what was happening. She could not understand how the cheap, clueless old contractor had just effortlessly overridden her absolute authority in the most exclusive building in the city. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit, maintaining my cold, unwavering stare. The execution had officially begun. I left Beverly standing there, in a frozen state of terror, a woman who realized the impenetrable walls of her fortress were made of nothing but cheap, crumbling paper. I did not look back at her, nor did I offer a single word of explanation. I simply turned away from the terrified security guards and began my slow, deliberate march toward the center of the grand ballroom. The lavish party was in full swing around me. A classical string quartet was playing a soft, elegant melody, near the massive ice sculptures, their notes blending perfectly with the low, sophisticated murmur of hundreds of wealthy guests. But as I moved deeper into the sea of tailored tuxedos and expensive silk gowns, a strange phenomenon occurred. The ambient noise seemed to dial back almost imperceptibly at first. The people standing in my direct path stopped their polite conversations. They turned their heads, their eyes locking onto the grim, imposing figure cutting straight through their glittering social circle. I did not belong in their world, and yet I commanded the space with an undeniable heavy gravity that forced them to step aside and clear a wide path for me to walk through. At the far end of this ballroom stood an elevated stage decorated with cascading floral arrangements and professional lighting. Standing behind the polished wooden podium was Derek. He was holding a microphone, leaning forward, with the confident, relaxed posture of a man who believed he held the entire world in the palm of his hand. He was in the middle of delivering his keynote address, a sickeningly pompous monologue designed to solicit both admiration and venture capital from the captive audience. His voice echoed through the high-quality sound system, smooth, charismatic, and entirely fabricated. He was speaking about the immense burdens of leadership, the grueling, lonely journey of the visionary entrepreneur, and the unparalleled resilience required to build a technology empire from the ground up. He used buzzwords effortlessly, spinning a majestic tale of late nights, brilliant innovations, and the self-made genius that had supposedly propelled him to the absolute pinnacle of Seattle society. He spoke of overcoming adversity, of pulling himself up by his bootstraps, completely omitting the fact that those bootstraps were purchased with the stolen equity of his father-in-law's lifelong labor. The wealthy investors and high society socialites in the audience were nodding along, completely captivated by the charming, handsome fraud standing before them. They raised their crystal champagne flutes in silent tribute to his fictional struggles. But as I drew closer to the stage, the guests nearest to the front row began to notice the dark, unyielding figure advancing down the center aisle. The polite applause following one of Derek's carefully rehearsed punchlines began to falter, dying out in awkward, scattered claps. The front rows fell completely silent. Derek, sensing the sudden, unnatural shift in the room's energy, paused his speech. His perfect, gleaming smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he squinted past the bright stage lights, trying to identify the source of the disruption. When his eyes finally adjusted to the glare and locked onto my face, the transformation was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying to witness. The charismatic, untouchable Chief Executive Officer vanished instantly, replaced by a panicked, cornered animal, staring directly into the headlights of an oncoming freight train. I did not stop walking. I reached the bottom of the short, carpeted staircase leading up to the main stage and placed my polished leather shoe onto the first step. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the musicians lowering their bows as the thick, heavy tension in the ballroom reached a breaking point. Hundreds of eyes darted nervously between the pale, sweating man at the podium and the cold, imposing figure ascending the stairs. I climbed the steps with a slow, heavy, measured rhythm, my boots hitting the wooden stage with a thud that resonated through the quiet room. Derek gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. He looked desperately out into the crowd, scanning the faces of his wealthy guests, searching frantically for his mother or the security guards, praying that someone would intervene and save him from the reckoning that had just arrived at his doorstep. But no one moved. The elite of Seattle simply stood in stunned silence, watching the beautifully constructed facade of the Stanton family begin to publicly fracture. I stepped up to the podium, stopping just inches away from Derek. I could smell the sharp, sour scent of cold sweat breaking through his expensive cologne. His chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He tried to maintain his composure, forcing a stiff, terrifyingly fake laugh into the microphone. He leaned toward me, shielding his mouth from the audience, and spoke in a frantic, desperate whisper. "Dad, what the hell are you doing up here?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a raw, uncontainable panic. "Get off the stage right now. You are embarrassing me in front of my investors. You are ruining everything. Please just walk away before I have you arrested." I did not respond to his pathetic whispered threats. I did not raise my voice, and I did not show a single ounce of anger. I simply reached out with my heavy, scarred hand and calmly, effortlessly plucked the microphone right out of his trembling fingers. He let out a weak, choked gasp, completely paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying calm radiating from my posture. I held the microphone loosely in my right hand, feeling the cold, smooth metal against my palm. Derek stumbled backward, retreating a few clumsy steps away from the podium, as if the physical proximity to the truth was burning him. He looked out at the massive sea of faces, staring up at the stage, his eyes wide and pleading, but he found no salvation in the crowd. The wealthy investors, the socialites who had just been drinking his expensive champagne and applauding his fictional genius, were now watching him with narrowed, suspicious eyes. The collective intuition of the room had suddenly shifted. They did not know exactly what was happening, but they could smell the distinct, undeniable scent of a massive fraud being exposed in real time. The silence in the grand ballroom became absolute, stretching out into a tense, suffocating vacuum. No one dared to speak. No one dared to clink a glass or whisper to their neighbor. The entire room was holding its collective breath, waiting for the heavy, rusted axe to finally fall on the neck of a man who had lied to every single person in the building. I stood at the center of the podium, looking out over the glittering, opulent room. I thought about the sheer amount of stolen money it took to rent this space, to hire the tuxedoed waiters to carve those ridiculous ice sculptures. I thought about my daughter Melanie, hiding somewhere in the back of this massive hall, wearing a beautiful dress, while her entire life crumbled from within. I thought about my late wife Patty, who had worked her fingers to the bone, packing my lunches in the dark, believing that our sacrifices would build a safe, honorable future for our family. She had been insulted, mocked, and degraded by the people who had stolen everything we built. They had taken our foundation and used it to fund a criminal, degenerate lifestyle, masking their toxic greed with golden invitations and fake charity galas. The time for hiding behind corporate veils and polite society was officially over. I was going to rip the curtains down and expose the hideous, rotting core of their existence. I was going to show these venture capitalists the true cost of their celebrated prodigy. I did not yell into the microphone. I did not launch into a furious, screaming tirade. I simply raised my left hand and tapped the metal mesh of the microphone twice with my index finger. The sharp, heavy thumps echoed violently through the massive speakers, reverberating against the vaulted ceilings and securing the undivided, terrifying attention of every single soul in the building. I maintained my cold, unyielding stare, locking eyes with Derek, who was now trembling uncontrollably in the shadows of the stage lights. With slow, deliberate, and agonizingly precise movements, I reached inside my custom-tailored suit jacket. My fingers closed around the thick, heavy stack of paper resting in my breast pocket. I pulled the dense bundle out into the harsh, bright glare of the stage lights. The documents were thick, bound with heavy legal clips, and stamped aggressively across the front with glaring, undeniable red ink. They were the absolute, finalized legal foreclosure notices, the commercial default declarations, and the indisputable debt acquisition papers, proving I owned every single cent of their miserable existence. The entire ballroom fell into a deathly, paralyzing silence. I held the thick stack of documents in my left hand, the stark red ink of the foreclosure notices catching the glare of the stage lights. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum, waiting for the first word to drop. I brought the microphone close to my mouth. I did not need to shout. The acoustics of the grand ballroom carried my voice, perfectly amplifying the cold, unyielding authority resonating in my chest. "Good evening," I began, my tone steady and conversational, as if I were giving a toast rather than a financial execution. "Many of you do not know who I am. You are the elite of Seattle. You are venture capitalists, private equity managers, and celebrated socialites. You deal in millions in term sheets and in visionary projections. My name is Richard Caldwell. I do not deal in projections. I am a retired construction contractor. I deal in concrete, in steel, and in absolute reality. I looked out over the sea of bewildered faces. The attendees were glancing at each other, confused by the abrupt shift in the evening's programming. I pointed to the man cowering just a few feet away from me. Derek Stanton has spent the last hour standing on this stage selling you a magnificent story of self-made success. He has asked you for your trust, for your admiration, and most importantly, for your capital. He has painted himself as a brilliant pioneer of the technology sector. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a brutal, agonizing second. Derek Stanton is a complete categorical fraud. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. A few investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces tightening with sudden suspicion. I watched the realization dawn on the faces of the city's most powerful financiers. Men and women who prided themselves on their sharp instincts were suddenly grappling with the fact that they had been utterly charmed by a con artist. They were looking at Derek not with admiration, but with the cold, calculating scrutiny of predators who had just realized their prey was toxic. Derek let out a pathetic, strangled sound, shaking his head frantically at the audience. He was entirely paralyzed, unable to move forward and take the microphone back. I raised the thick stack of papers in my hand, making sure the red stamps were visible to everyone. The revolutionary technology startup you are all here to celebrate does not exist, I continued, my voice echoing through the massive speakers. It has no proprietary software. It has no product line. It has absolutely zero legitimate revenue streams. It is nothing more than a hollow shell corporation registered in Delaware. Derek does not employ a team of brilliant developers. He pays for a virtual receptionist and a shared mailing address to maintain the illusion of a corporate footprint. The money he used to rent this breathtaking ballroom tonight, the money used to buy the imported champagne you are currently drinking, did not come from brilliant business acquisitions. It came from stealing. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, transforming into a low, buzzing hive of panicked whispers. High-profile investors were pulling out their cell phones, likely texting their financial analysts to immediately freeze any pending negotiations with Derek's firm. Derek was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under his expensive, tailored suit. "Dad, please stop," he pleaded in a broken, miserable whisper, but his voice was not picked up by the microphone. I ignored him entirely. I turned my gaze away from the disgraced executive and scanned the crowded ballroom until my eyes locked onto my true target. Beverly Stanton was standing frozen near the center aisle. The two large security guards were still hovering a few steps away from her, watching the spectacle on stage with morbid fascination. Beverly looked like a woman who had just stepped onto a hidden landmine and was waiting for the inevitable detonation. Her face was ashen, her breathing rapid and shallow. She tried to maintain her posture, lifting her chin in a desperate display of aristocratic defiance, but her eyes betrayed the absolute suffocating terror consuming her from the inside out. I leaned into the microphone, narrowing my focus exclusively on her. "Beverly Stanton," I called out, my voice slicing through the rising noise of the crowd like a heavy, sharpened blade. The room immediately fell quiet again, every single head turning to look at the woman, standing frozen in her crimson designer dress. "You have spent the better part of your life looking down on people who work for a living. You sat at a restaurant table last week drinking wine I paid for and called my late wife low-class trash. You mocked my blue-collar roots. You demanded respect simply because you believe you are inherently superior. But real wealth, Beverly, is built on a solid foundation. Your foundation is built entirely on pathological greed and crippling addiction." Beverly gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Several of her wealthy socialite friends physically recoiled, stepping away from her as if she were suddenly contagious. I tapped the heavy stack of documents against the wooden podium. "You have spent the last 3 years funneling millions of stolen dollars into high-stakes underground casinos, offshore sports betting syndicates, and manic, uncontrolled luxury shopping sprees. When the legitimate commercial loans ran dry, you did not stop. You turned to the shadows, You borrowed millions from unregulated predatory lending groups. You brought violent, dangerous criminals right to the doorstep of the home where my innocent grandson sleeps. You accumulated $3.3 million in shadow debt, and you expected my daughter and my retirement pension to act as your collateral. Tears were streaming down Beverly's face, now ruining her expensive makeup. She shook her head desperately, covering her mouth with her trembling, heavily jeweled hands. The socialites around her were whispering furiously, their expressions morphing from shock to absolute unforgiving disgust. They were witnessing the total destruction of a woman who had lied to them for years. I am sure you were incredibly relieved last week. I continued, my tone growing darker, more relentless. I am sure you were thrilled when you received the official notice that a new private equity firm had stepped in to consolidate your massive toxic debts. I am sure you celebrated when they granted you a temporary extension, allowing you to throw this lavish, pathetic masquerade ball tonight. You thought you had outsmarted the system. You thought you had bought yourself enough time to scam these investors and cover your tracks. I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to deliver the final, fatal strike. The anonymous, limited liability company that acquired your $3.3 million in gambling and shadow debt was not a private equity firm, Beverly. The Delaware corporation that completely bought out your ruthless, violent predators is registered exclusively to me. I own every single cent of your debt. I hold the primary commercial lien on the Bellevue mansion. I own your house. I own your cars. I own the designer shoes on your feet. Beverly's knees buckled. She let out a piercing, agonizing wail that echoed horribly through the grand ballroom. She collapsed onto the pristine carpet, sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands as her entire fabricated universe shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her extravagant diamond necklace caught the light, a sparkling, cruel reminder of the theft that had funded her entire existence. Not a single person in the room reached out to help her. They simply stared at the broken, ruined woman, weeping on the floor. I turned my attention back to the podium, letting my eyes sweep across the vast, chaotic room. I searched the faces in the back until I saw her. Melanie. My daughter was standing near the exit, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But they were not tears of sorrow. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of absolute relief in her eyes. The heavy chains of her captivity had just been publicly shattered. I had exposed the fraud. I had reclaimed my family's stolen dignity. I had executed my promise to the absolute letter. But a cornered, desperate animal does not simply surrender when the trap finally snaps shut. Derek Stanton had been stripped of his company, his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. He had absolutely nothing left to lose, and the sheer blinding reality of his total annihilation finally broke his mind. He let out a primal, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated rage. His eyes went completely wild, filled with a violent, reckless insanity. "You ruined my life," he roared, his voice cracking as he lunged forward. He launched his entire body weight toward me in a blind, frantic panic. His arms outstretched, desperately, trying to grab the microphone, trying to silence the truth, trying to physically tear me away from the podium. I did not flinch. I planted my heavy work boots firmly against the wooden floorboards, bracing my shoulders for the impact. But before his desperate, grasping hands could even make contact with my suit jacket, the heavy brass-handled mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom violently burst open. The deafening, unmistakable wail of police sirens pierced through the thick, heavy walls of the country club, filling the night air with a shrill, terrifying urgency. The sheer force of the breached doors caused the entire crowd to scream and scatter in absolute panic. A dozen men wearing dark, heavy tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stormed into the glittering room. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, their heavy boots trampling over the plush carpets. They bypassed the fleeing investors, bypassed the weeping Beverly on the floor, and marched straight down the center aisle. They raised their weapons, the bright beams of their tactical flashlights, cutting through the dim, elegant lighting of the gala, pointing straight up at the stage, pointing straight at Derek. Federal agents. Nobody move. Derek Stanton, keep your hands exactly where we can see them. A commanding voice boomed over a tactical bullhorn, completely drowning out the ambient panic in the ballroom. Derek froze. The wild insanity in his eyes evaporated instantly, replaced by the primal terror of a man who realized there was absolutely no escape. He stopped dead in his tracks, his momentum completely broken by the overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement. Two heavily armored agents rushed up the carpeted steps of the stage, their tactical boots thundering against the wooden floorboards. They did not gently apprehend the celebrated tech entrepreneur. They hit him with the blunt, uncompromising force reserved for fleeing felons. One agent grabbed Derek by the shoulder of his expensive designer jacket and drove him hard into the polished surface of the podium. The heavy wood splintered under the impact. Derek let out a sharp, breathless gasp as his chest slammed against the wood, his face pressed aggressively down into the scattered pages of his own fraudulent keynote speech. The second agent grabbed his wrists, twisting them sharply behind his back. The cold, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tight, echoed through the microphone, amplifying his absolute degradation across the entire silent ballroom. Derek Stanton, the lead agent, announced, his voice entirely devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, and the forgery of financial documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Derek did not fight back. He did not scream his innocence. He simply hung his head in shame. His knees buckled slightly as the agents held him up by his bound arms. The brilliant, untouchable chief executive officer had been reduced to a pathetic, weeping criminal in front of the very people he had tried to swindle. The venture capitalists and elite socialites watched in stunned horror, silently stepping backward, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of his spectacular collapse. While the federal agents secured Derek on the stage, a different kind of justice was unfolding on the ballroom floor. Beverly Stanton, realizing that the federal raid meant the total annihilation of her son's protection, broke out of her frozen state of shock. Survival instincts honed by years of manipulating the system and running from the consequences of her crippling addictions finally kicked in. She hitched up the heavy fabric of her crimson designer dress, kicked off her cripplingly expensive high heels, and scrambled frantically toward the back of the venue. She was making a desperate, pathetic dash for the heavy swinging doors leading into the catering kitchen, hoping to slip out through the service alley and vanish into the Seattle night before the federal agents could ask her any questions about her offshore accounts. She pushed her way through the retreating crowd of wealthy guests, shoving aside the very socialites she had been desperately trying to impress just an hour ago. She reached the polished wooden doors of the kitchen, her chest heaving and her makeup completely ruined by her tears. She threw her hands forward, preparing to push the swinging doors open and run blindly into the corridor, but the doors did not open. Standing directly on the other side, blocking the entire exit with their massive frames, were two incredibly large, imposing men. They were not wearing the crisp white tuxedos of the catering staff, nor were they wearing the subtle suits of the country club security detail. They were dressed in dark, functional clothing, their faces set in hard, unforgiving lines, carved by years of working in the most dangerous, violent sectors of the underground financial world. Beverly gasped, stumbling backward, her bare feet slipping on the polished marble floor. She recognized them instantly. They were the primary enforcers from the Shadow Lending Group, the very men who had been relentlessly hunting her down for the past 6 months. But they were not here to break her legs or drag her into an unmarked vehicle. They were holding official laminated corporate identification badges. The badges clearly displayed the logo of the anonymous Delaware Limited Liability Company I had established just days ago. They were no longer operating in the shadows as violent criminals. They were now fully licensed, bonded, and legally contracted asset recovery agents, officially employed by me to to collect on my newly acquired debt. Going somewhere tonight. Beverly, the larger of the two men, asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised absolute misery. You have an outstanding balance, and our new employer wants to make sure you do not leave the premises until we discuss the immediate liquidation of your personal assets. Beverly let out a horrific, guttural, trembling sob. She collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor, her hands gripping her hair in a display of absolute, unrelenting despair. She was trapped. There was no more running. There were no more extensions. The massive debt had finally come due. I watched the scene unfold from the elevated vantage point of the stage. The federal agents were marching Derek down the steps, parading him through the center aisle toward the flashing red and blue lights waiting outside the main entrance. The wealthy attendees were rapidly filtering out of the side doors, fleeing the disaster zone like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The grand, opulent charity gala had been completely dismantled in less than 10 minutes. I turned my gaze away from the retreating crowd and looked toward the far corner of the room. Melanie had not moved from her spot near the grand pillars. She was no longer standing. My daughter had collapsed entirely to her knees, the heavy emerald silk of her expensive gown pooling around her on the floor like shattered glass. She had her hands pressed over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut, weeping in a state of pure, overwhelming shock. The elaborate, suffocating illusion she had been forced to live in for the past 3 years had just been violently ripped away, leaving her exposed, terrified, and completely disoriented. I slowly walked down the carpeted steps of the stage. I did not rush. I moved with the calm, measured pace of a man walking through a demolition site after the dust has finally begun to settle. I navigated past the overturned chairs and the abandoned champagne flutes. I walked straight toward the corner where my daughter was weeping on the floor. I stopped just inches away from her. I looked down at her shaking shoulders, feeling a profound, heavy ache in my chest. I had spent my entire life trying to shield her from the brutal realities of the world. But in doing so, I had inadvertently left her vulnerable to a predator who hid behind a charming smile and a tailored suit. I lowered myself slowly to the floor, kneeling directly beside her. The thick fabric of my suit brushed against her silk dress. I reached out with my scarred hand. I gently grasped her chin, applying just enough pressure to force her to lift her head. She opened her eyes. They were red, swollen, and filled with a desperate, pleading terror. She looked at me like a drowning victim searching for a life raft. She expected me to pull her into my arms, to tell her everything was going to be fine, and to promise her that I would fix the entire situation just like I always did. But I was not going to fix this for her. I was not going to rebuild a cage that she needed to escape from. I am not saving the house, I told her. My voice was incredibly stern, carrying the heavy, uncompromising weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. The bank takes it all tomorrow. Melanie let out a choked gasp, tears spilling over her eyelashes, but I did not soften my grip. I maintained intense, unwavering eye contact, forcing her to hear every single word I was saying. You are going to divorce that criminal. I continued my tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. And you are going to get a job. I will protect my grandson, but I will not carry you anymore. You walk out of here on your own 2 feet, or you fall with them. I released her chin and stood back up, towering over her trembling form. I stood in silence, waiting for her to process my freezing ultimatum. She turned her head slowly, looking at her handcuffed husband being shoved into an armored vehicle. She looked at her screaming mother-in-law, surrounded by towering, merciless debt collectors. Melanie looked at the absolute destruction of the people who had treated her like an indentured servant. She took a deep, shaky breath, wiping the smeared tears from her cheeks. She reached up, wrapping her delicate fingers firmly around my scarred hand. With a determined surge of energy, she pulled herself up from the floor, turned her back on the shattered remnants of the Stanton family, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. Exactly 6 long, transformative months passed since that explosive night at the country club. The monumental collapse of the Stanton family did not happen quietly. It was a truly spectacular, highly publicized implosion that fed the local news cycle for several consecutive weeks. The ashes of their fabricated empire scattered across the damp Seattle landscape, leaving nothing but hard, unforgiving reality in their wake. The massive Bellevue mansion, the property I had originally purchased with the sweat of my own back, was swiftly seized by the commercial banks. The locks were changed, the heavy iron gates were chained, and the sprawling estate was unceremoniously auctioned off to the highest bidder to satisfy the massive federal tax liens. I did not step in to save it. I watched the auction notice clear the public registry with a profound sense of absolute closure. The physical monument to their arrogance was permanently gone, wiped, completely clean from the earth. But the legal and personal consequences of their criminal actions were only just beginning to take root. Derek Stanton, the visionary chief executive officer who had once commanded rooms full of wealthy investors, found himself sitting in a cold, sterile interrogation room with federal prosecutors. His expensive tailored suits were permanently confiscated, replaced by the standard-issue drab uniform of a federal detainee. Faced with a mountain of undeniable forensic evidence, the shredded shadow loan documents, the meticulously traced offshore wire transfers, and the irrefutable proof of my forged signature, his high-priced defense attorney advised immediate capitulation. The federal government does not negotiate with arrogance. They presented a ruthless plea deal. Derek took it. He stood before a federal judge, his head bowed, and pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, and felony forgery. The judge, entirely unmoved by his weeping apologies, sentenced him to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. The reality of a concrete cell and a steel toilet finally broke his spirit. In a pathetic display of lingering entitlement, he attempted to call my cell phone from the holding facility. He left frantic, sobbing voicemails on my carrier service begging me to unfreeze my anonymous corporate assets and pay for a team of appellate lawyers to reduce his sentence. He promised he would pay me back. He swore he had changed. I did not listen to a single one of those desperate pleas. I had contacted my cellular provider the very morning after the charity gala and permanently blocked his number from ever reaching my phone again. The silence that followed was absolute and incredibly peaceful. While Derek traded his luxury vehicle for a prison transport bus, his mother faced a punishment that for a woman of her supreme vanity was arguably far worse than incarceration. Beverly Stanton was systematically and ruthlessly stripped of every single asset she possessed. The anonymous limited liability company I controlled executed its legal rights with surgical, uncompromising precision. The designer shoes, the imported silk dresses, and the sparkling diamond necklaces she had flaunted at the country club were all seized, cataloged, and liquidated by my contracted asset recovery agents. The federal bankruptcy courts took whatever was left. Beverly was legally declared destitute. Her entire social standing evaporated overnight. The wealthy friends who had once orbited her, drinking her champagne and complimenting her fake interior design business, suddenly treated her like a highly contagious disease. They ignored her phone calls. They crossed the street when they saw her walking down the sidewalk. They pretended she simply did not exist. With no money, no home, and a crushing mountain of remaining federal tax debt hovering over her head, Beverly was forced to relocate. She moved out of the elite manicured neighborhoods and into a tiny rundown subsidized apartment complex on the far industrial edge of the city. The walls were thin, the plumbing leaked, and the air constantly smelled of cheap cooking oil and damp carpet. To satisfy her mandatory repayment agreement with the Internal Revenue Service, Beverly had to secure immediate employment. The woman who had once screamed at a waiter for spilling a drop of wine was now working the grueling night shift at a local discount supermarket. She spent her nights pushing a heavy industrial mop bucket down the brightly lit aisles, scrubbing scuff marks off the linoleum floors while wearing a cheap polyester uniform. She spent her days sleeping in a cramped room, trapped in a prison constructed entirely by her own grotesque, unrelenting greed. Amidst the absolute devastation of the Stanton family, a quiet, steady resurrection was taking place. Melanie had walked out of the Bellevue Country Club that night, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the absolute certainty that she was finally free. She filed for divorce the very next morning, severing all legal and financial ties to Derek before the federal indictments could drag her down into the abyss. She did not return to my cabin to hide. She did not ask me to buy her another house or fund her recovery. Instead, my daughter found her own strength. She secured a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, working-class neighborhood, signing the lease under her own maiden name. It was not a sprawling mansion, and it did not have marble floors, but it was safe, clean, and entirely hers. To support herself and my grandson, Leo, Melanie took a grueling entry-level administrative job at a local logistics company. She woke up at dawn, packed Leo a lunch, dropped him off at a modest daycare, and spent 8 hours a day managing shipping manifests and answering ringing telephones. Her hands, which had once been forced to scrub floors in submission, were now building a legitimate, honest foundation for her child. She was exhausted, her days long and demanding, but the heavy dark circles under her eyes had completely vanished. She looked vibrant. She looked resilient. She looked exactly like her mother. I watched her progress from a respectful distance, ensuring they were safe without intervening in her daily struggles. I wanted her to feel the immense pride of earning her own survival. That pride was the only thing that could permanently immunize her against manipulative predators like Derek. I knew the physical labor was difficult for her, but I also knew the tremendous value of a calloused hand. Building a life from scratch gives you an unbreakable sense of ownership over your own destiny. Exactly 6 months after the night of the gala, I was sitting at the wooden kitchen table in my quiet cabin. The autumn leaves were beginning to fall outside the window, painting the forest floor in brilliant shades of copper, orange, and gold. The crisp morning air carried the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. I was drinking my morning coffee, letting the peace of the quiet woods settle into my bones, when I heard the sound of tires crunching slowly on the gravel driveway. I set my ceramic mug down on the table, walked to the heavy oak door, and pulled it open to the bright sunlight. Melanie was walking up the wooden steps, holding Leo by the small hand. She was wearing a simple, faded denim jacket, dark jeans, and comfortable walking shoes. She looked absolutely beautiful. She smiled warmly, her eyes clear and bright, and hugged me tightly. We sat together at the kitchen table, watching Leo play quietly on the living room rug with the wooden fire truck I had carved for him. We talked about her new job, the friendly coworkers she had met, about the upcoming winter preparations, and about the simple, mundane details of a normal, peaceful life. She did not complain about the long hours or the tight grocery budget. She did not mention her ex-husband wasting away in a concrete cell or the woman currently scrubbing floors at the local supermarket. The past was completely behind her. As she stood up to leave, gathering her wool coat and calling for Leo to put on his boots, Melanie reached deep into her pocket. She did not ask me for a handout. She did not ask for help with her upcoming utility bills or her monthly rent. Instead, she pulled out a crisp, bright white envelope and placed it gently on the center of my wooden table. I looked down at the paper envelope, then up at my daughter, a silent, curious question resting in my eyes. She offered a soft, genuine smile, her posture radiating an absolute dignity that reminded me of her late mother. "It is $500, she said quietly, her voice steady, confident, and overwhelmingly proud. "It is my first repayment installment for the money you spent on the lawyers to untangle my name from the legal mess. I know it is not a lot right now, but I promise you I will bring you another envelope exactly like this one every single month until my debt is completely cleared." I looked at that small, familiar white envelope quietly resting on the heavily scarred wood of my kitchen table. I did not reach out to hand it back to her. I did not tell her that she did not owe me a single cent, even though that was the absolute honest truth. To refuse that hard-earned money would be to selfishly steal the profound dignity she had just fought so hard to reclaim. I simply nodded, placed my rough, calloused hand gently over hers, and softly told her that I was incredibly proud of the woman she had become. She smiled a bright, unburdened expression that transformed her face before turning to walk out the heavy oak door with my only beautiful grandson. I followed them outside, stepping slowly onto the weathered planks of my front porch. The relentless Seattle rain that had battered the region for several days had finally broken. The dark gray storm clouds were fracturing, pulling apart to reveal a vast, breathtaking expanse of clear twilight sky. The setting sun cast long, brilliant streaks of amber and crushed gold across the jagged horizon, illuminating the towering pine trees that formed a protective wall around my property. The evening air was incredibly crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of wet cedar needles and turning soil. It was the smell of endurance of living things that survived the storm and remain standing tall and unbothered long after the fragile, poorly built structures have been washed away into the mud. I walked over to the small rustic side table resting near my rocking chair. I picked up a heavy crystal tumbler filled with a pour of aged bourbon. The amber liquid glowed warmly in the rapidly fading daylight. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, complex flavor burned a pleasant, comforting trail down my throat, settling into a deep, quiet warmth blooming in my chest. I lowered my large frame slowly into the old wooden chair, the familiar creak of the joints grounding me firmly in the present moment. I looked out across the sprawling, damp grass of my front yard. Melanie had let go of Leo's hand, allowing the young boy to run freely through the open space. He was wearing bright yellow rain boots, stomping enthusiastically into a shallow mud puddle. A massive splash of water erupted around his small legs, and he let out a loud, joyous peal of pure laughter. It was a ringing sound that echoed through the quiet woods. Melanie did not scold him. She did not worry about his clothes getting ruined, or whether his behavior was acceptable for a high society gathering. She simply threw her head back and laughed along with him, her clear voice mingling with his in a melody of absolute freedom. They were completely unburdened. They were entirely free from the toxic, fake, rich environment that he had been born into. There were no arrogant mother-in-laws demanding absolute perfection. No frantic whispers about bounced credit cards, and no suffocating walls of anxiety built upon a foundation of stolen money and deceit. They had absolutely nothing to hide anymore, and in that beautiful, muddy simplicity, they possessed everything that truly mattered. I leaned back in my rocking chair, resting the cold glass against my leg, and allowed my mind to deeply reflect on the brutal, exhausting journey of the past several months. It is a strange, undeniable truth about the nature of wealth. Money in its rawest form is completely neutral. It is simply paper and electronic digits on a screen. But the moment you accumulate it, it becomes a powerful, inescapable magnet for greedy leeches and manipulative parasites. It attracts the worst kind of people, those who believe that your hard work exists solely to subsidize their own grotesque vanity. They will look at your quiet generosity and convince themselves that they are entitled to the fruits of your labor. They will look at your silence and assume you are ignorant. They will mistake your kindness for weakness, and they will always mistake your advancing age for sheer stupidity. Derek Stanton and his mother had looked at me and seen nothing but a clueless, accommodating old man. They saw a blue-collar contractor they could manipulate, drain, and eventually discard when I was no longer financially useful to them. But they fundamentally and fatally misunderstood the nature of the man they were trying to bury. A man who has spent 40 consecutive years pouring heavy concrete and laying thick steel rebar understands the absolute unbreakable laws of physics and structure. I know exactly how much immense physical pressure a support beam can take before it begins to fracture. I know exactly how deep you have to dig into the cold earth to build a foundation that can withstand a hurricane. And more importantly, when the rot sets in, when the structure becomes dangerously compromised by toxic, parasitic elements, I know exactly where to place the charges to demolish the entire building. You do not need to scream or flinch to bring a skyscraper to the ground. You just need to find the critical load-bearing pillars and quietly, methodically remove them from the equation entirely. They truly thought they had won. They thought they could embarrass me in a crowded steakhouse, threaten my access to my own grandson, and command me to walk out into the cold rain without fighting back in any way. They demanded that I remove myself from their pristine fabricated world so they could continue to feast on my resources without the annoying reminder of where that wealth actually came from. I took another slow sip of the dark-aged bourbon, watching the very last sliver of the golden sun dip below the jagged tree line, plunging the deep, sprawling woods into a beautifully quiet, endlessly peaceful twilight. They told me to disappear, so I did. Right into the shadows where I built the trap that buried them all. What do you think about Richard's silent but lethal counterattack in this story? Was leaving his son-in-law and the mother-in-law to face the absolute wrath of the law too ruthless? Or was it the exact price they deserved to pay for their sheer arrogance and betrayal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below so we can discuss. If this story gave you strong emotions and valuable life lessons, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to help us bring you more thrilling videos. Thank you for watching until the very end, and always remember, the strongest foundation in life is built on honesty and gratitude.